Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lizzie Scheja, and I'm the director of Judith Kultur i Sverige. Welcome to the Royal College of Music on this very special evening. It makes us very happy to see a full house on this Nobel evening. And as you might guess, the date, December 10th, was not chosen by coincidence. There is a meaning to why we chose that date. It is a manifestation to an author whom we love very much. And in these coming 3 hours, with one intermission of a half hour, we will give you a glimpse of Philip Roth's life and work. And hopefully you will get the taste of it and understand why we chose that date. I'm very happy, but I'm also sad. I'm sad because Philip Roth should have been here with us. Adam, who's going to open the session, the first session, can testify to how eager I was to bring Philip Roth to Stockholm. Alas, May 22nd of this year made this wish impossible to accomplish, and so this is the least that we could do. By saying the least, I want to stress that some of Philip Roth's closest and most significant persons are here with us. They came from far to honor him. Adam Gopnik, Bernard Avishai, Lisa Halliday, Judith Thurman, and Claudia Roth Pierpont are all here with us, including some Swedish friends, Daniel Sandström, Johan Rabeus, and special acknowledgement to the students of this school, to the members of the Royal College of Music Symphony Orchestra who prepared a music program for this evening. This program is being live streamed in different channels. It is being streamed at the 92nd Y Street on the very prestigious platform 92nd Y On Demand, and we're very happy to be on that platform. So I want to thank them for their cooperation, and also to Tablet Magazine and to YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Studies in New York, for their cooperation in doing some PR for us and telling everybody about this special program. Special thank you goes also to the Library of America, who sent us the 10-volume of Roth, the complete Roth works, which are here on display. And in a few days, this event will be screened on the site of the Library of America. So we are very grateful. And we thank all of our friends and partners in New York City. These relationships and dialogue have been cultivated and will continue to be cultivated by Jewish culture in Sweden. I want to thank also Albert Bonniers Publishing House for their cooperation, and also to the Swedish Art Council, to the City of Stockholm, and to the Stockholm region for their support. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to invite our moderator, Ricki Neuman. Ricki Neuman is a journalist, writer, and an engaged member in Jewish culture in Sweden, and I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. It's an honor to be here, and also a special pleasure, since I have a long history with this author and his books. I lived for 12 years on the Jewish Upper West Side in Manhattan, where Philip Roth was a household name. Everyone had read him, at least in my circles. Not everyone loved him. A lot of women did not. And we will return later on this evening to that subject matter. I did. For me, it was a first. The first time I saw parts of myself mirrored and remarked upon and made fun of. For example, in a novel called Portnoy's Complaint. And we'll return to that too. Growing up here in Stockholm as a Swedish Jew, I never saw myself reflected in the public square. My new Jewish friends in New York, on the other hand, had all grown up in a city where you saw images of Jewish people all over. Television, books, theater, movies. And I do remember that I even felt some envy. So I started to read him all I could get. This was 1975, and he had already written 12 books. I started to read and met a funny and complicated author, and a very un-Swedish writer, and we'll return to that too. This evening is officially a tribute to Philip Roth, and in addition we will try to get a little closer to the author and the person. With the help of a number of great guests that Lizzie introduced, most of them from the US and most of them friends of Philip. They will be our guides this evening. And what could be better than to start with Adam Gopnik? He's a writer and author, best known as a staff writer for The New Yorker, to which he has contributed fiction and criticism since 1986. And he will now provide us with an overview, give us a landscape, with his friend Philip in the middle. Please give Adam a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here tonight to honor someone who was a dear friend of many of us who are on the stage tonight, a dearer and more intimate friend of several of my colleagues than even I can claim, but who was above all a great writer and a major writer. And when we ask ourselves, what is it that distinguishes a major writer, a great writer, from all of us scribblers who occupy lower positions on Mount Parnassus, I think we can say that it involves 4 overlapping, enveloping gifts or accomplishments. First, a great writer has an original voice. Second, a great writer has an urgent subject. Third, he or she must have an original obsession. And finally, he or she must have a significant purpose. And out of those things, a voice, a subject, an obsession, and a purpose, great literature is made. Philip Roth, I want to suggest to you tonight, had all of those. First of all, he had a voice, an unforgettable voice. It was, in its first appearance and always throughout the development of his work, a great comic voice, a great humorous voice. And the comedy that came so naturally to him was essential to all of his vision of life. Philip Roth was categorically the funniest man I have ever met. You can see his humor in all of his writing, but trust me, he was even funnier in life. A quick story. On the memorable day when Philip Roth did not win the Nobel Prize, but it was instead won by Bob Dylan, I had a previous and a long-standing date to visit him in the hospital, as I recall. Philip was sporadically in and out of the hospital in the last years, and I had no idea what I was going to say to him on this auspicious morning, because there was no doubt that he coveted, if not exactly yearned for, that prize, and it had gone to Bob Dylan instead. So as I was rounding the corner into his hospital room, completely unsure of what to say, I heard his distinctive voice crying out, "Adam, I have wonderful news." I paused. He said, "I've just been nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame." That was Philip Roth. It was Philip making up a line, knowing that he needed a line in the way of any great comedian for that moment, but it was also Philip with his enormous quickness to spot the fake pieties in the world. He knew that the piety of the world was graciousness at a moment of disappointment, and he knew that another piety was that we belong to one institution or the other. He was quickly and spontaneously funny about everything and chiefly about himself. I remember him coming to the door of our apartment to give books as presents to our children and calling out as he arrived, "Okay, who wants mortality and who wants adultery?" Now, we tend, as one of the oddities of our cultural norms, to deprecate, to underrate a little bit anyone who has a great gift for comedy, because like a great gift for melody, it seems to come so much from inside that we hardly value it as we value other more obviously serious and applied gifts. But within that gift for comedy were two extraordinary talents. First, a talent for American speech. Philip Roth had one of the three great ears for the sound of the American vernacular in all of American literature. The others, I think, belong to Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, the great J.D. Salinger, and Roth. I submitted this to him once as a little goad, and he said, "Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true," he said, "except that Updike had the eye and Saul Bellow had the nose." He said, "Bellow writes with his nose." A wonderful and typical Roth-like insight and statement. So there had to be that ear, that attentiveness to the sound of the American landscape. And then any great comedian always has a relentless appetite to replace piety with audacity, to look at all the normal pieties of life, all the things you're supposed to say, all the things you're supposed to feel, and replace them with what we actually feel, with what we actually do, with the way we actually behave. A comic gift, far from being the frosting on literature, is the test of its courage, its willingness to confront piety and replace it with truth. Philip Roth's comic voice did that relentlessly for more than 50 years. Second, a great writer needs a great subject, and Philip Roth found it in the nature of American Jewish experience. Now, my dear friend Bernie Avishai is going to talk more about the specific book that became notorious, Portnoy's Complaint, a book whose notoriety is perhaps out of proportion to its place in the entirety of Roth's canon. But nonetheless, in that book, as in so many others, what we find is not, as some of his less discerning critics on the Upper West Side — I'm glad I come from the Jewish Upper East Side, as it happens. We read there with more acuity. That far from being some kind of protest or sign of disdain for the people he had been raised among, on the contrary, it is one of the most moving accounts of the perpetual push and pull between the closed and comforting world that we all are born in, of common ethnic identity, and the larger beckoning world of cosmopolitan experience that pulls all of us, Swedes and Jews and humanity alike, out of our closed societies into the larger and more threatening world. There's no more affectionate portrayal in all of American literature of a Jewish upbringing than exists in Portnoy's Complaint, right along with its tales of complaint, claustrophobia, confinement, and dissatisfaction. There's a long section about a Jewish softball team playing on Sunday mornings in Newark, which is one of the most beautiful evocations of the period and of its manners you can ever find. Philip loved to talk with enormous affection about the manners, the mores of the Jewish world that he grew up in. I remember him once talking at enormous length, explaining to our children what it meant to be a Jewish pharmacist, how important it was to be a pharmacist, because a pharmacist sat right between the higher professions of doctoring and lawyering and the lower white-collar professions of being in the insurance business or being blue-collar worker running a grocery, like my grandfather. A pharmacist wore a white coat, Philip explained to the kids, and a pharmacist got to stand up high on a platform and take pills from big bottles and put them into little bottles. That made you a truly professional person if you were a Jewish pharmacist. That love and affection for the details of Jewish life was the material that Philip Roth used over and over again. And yet, his engagement with that passage from the closed to the open society, from the clan world to the cosmopolitan world, was not only a story about American Jews, it was a story that had a universal application. It was one of the great stories of the 20th century. It was the same story that V.S. Naipaul told over and over again in a different tone, about the need to emancipate yourself from your background, and yet the constant pull to return to that background. It's the same story that the great Eastern European writers who Philip so admired, Kundera and the rest of their peers, told again and again as well, the pull of the safe, beloved country in which one grew up, and the equally strong magnetic pull outward of Paris and of cosmopolitan civilization that seemed to suggest some larger arena. So Philip found in the transition, in the passage of American Jews from immigrant experience to a larger experience of American citizenship, a truly great subject that had universal meaning. It's not enough to have a great subject. That's what journalists have, and it's not what writers need. A writer's great subject has to be illuminated by a grand and original obsession. And for Philip Roth, that grand and original obsession was erotica, was the erotic life of human beings. Now, that was hardly a completely original obsession. It's an obsession doubtless shared by every human being in this room. But Philip wrote about it with a particular kind of audacity and relentlessness. It was a subject that he chose never to leave, didn't want to leave even when it would have been in his immediate critical interest to leave it or abandon it or alter it. And he chose it, I think, not only for the normal and healthy human reason that the erotic life is endlessly interesting, but even more because it is, in modern existence, the one theater, the one place where we all have to make decisive choices. In a world in which our choices are in many respects limited, in which religious choice, what we choose to believe about God, is no longer of huge significance in the world, when in some respects, until recently, our choices about what kind of governmental system to believe in seemed one of general concord and agreement. The choices we make in our erotic life, Philip Roth believed and dramatized, were the essential existential choices that would illuminate and dramatize our inner lives. Who we choose to sleep with, for how long and how often and with what degree of guilt, is the existential drama of modern men and women. And no writer took it on more obsessively, at greater risk, and with more courage than Philip Roth. Finally, along with a voice, a subject, and an obsession, a great writer, I think, has to have some large, significant purpose. Philip Roth kept that purpose somewhat sublimated, subterranean, until in the final years of his life, he, with enormous audacity, announced it again and again. He was concerned with the political survival of the liberal civilization of the United States. Now, he would not have put it in quite such editorial page terms. He hated the language of the editorial page and would not have used it. But that was really what he was most concerned about. In the final years of his life, after he claimed to have given up on the novel, he still wrote eloquently and at length about the American emergency and about the nature of true patriotism. And he located that true patriotism, as he understood it, not as a patriotism of class or creed, not as a patriotism of flag waving, but as a patriotism of a particular place. And he wrote at the end of his life that it was only through knowing his native city of Newark intimately and fully, only through dramatizing all of its claustrophobia and all of its richness, that he could understand what it was to be an American. That the more closely he looked at Newark, the more fully he understood American life. And that idea that we can have an authentic, a healthy kind of patriotism that doesn't involve the sickness of nationalism that is sweeping the world and was sweeping the world to Philip's enormous dismay in the last years of his life is, I think, a crucial one. And it's a theme that runs right through, a purpose that runs right through all of the work of Philip Roth. It's the purpose we find in American Pastoral, his great late novel, where the pull of revolutionary activity and the sheer relish and love of family and of business, of trade, of the very act of glove-making come into constant and meaningful conflict. It's the theme that he draws on even in the seemingly more narrow literary novels of the Zuckerman series, where the question, the Central American question of success and its meanings and its perils is asked over and over again. That question about what can be an authentic patriotism, that's That's the purpose, it seems to me, that was at the heart, at the center, and is one of the parts of the legacy that Philip Roth offers us. Towards the end of his life, he loved to come round to our family table and enter into long, joshing conversations with my then 17-year-old daughter, Olivia. Philip Roth, contrary to his reputation, loved the company of kids. Smart kids were his favorite company. He loved joking with them and sharing with them. And on a memorable night, the last night I had the great gift of having dinner with him, he and my daughter Olivia were working on a book in which a character called Philip Roth would be the only writer in America to actively admire Donald Trump. And this character, Philip Roth, by actively admiring Donald Trump, would therefore gain access to the Oval Office and be able to persuade Trump to behave properly. By praising Donald Trump so highly, Olivia, my daughter, pointed out, she said, "Philip, you're going to lose the good opinion of all of literary New York." And Philip laughed and said, "Not for the first time." And then he started talking about some lines of Shakespeare's that he loved. It's a very peculiar passage of Shakespeare that Philip mentioned. It's the one piece of Shakespeare's verse that survives in Shakespeare's own handwriting, an obscure passage from a play called The Life of Sir Thomas More. And it's all about the plight, this passage about the plight and misery of refugees. And in it, Shakespeare has Thomas More say, "If you expel these people, if you expel the immigrants, what country," goes on, "by the nature of your error, should give you harbor, should you need it? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain or Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England, why, you must needs be stranger. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper?" I remember Philip reading those lines with particular force, "that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford the helpless an abode on earth. With their detested knives against your throat spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owed not nor made not you, nor that the claimants were not all appropriate to your comforts, but chartered on to them. What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainous inhumanity, the mountainous inhumanity of those who reject the helpless and the refugee." And Philip looked at that again and said, this is the stranger's case. He said, "The stranger's case would be a very good title for a novel, you know." And he began to think about it, clearly. And at that moment, as we were talking, he was clearly thinking about it. And at that moment, his phone rang. And someone had programmed his phone with this sound, with the sound of a harp. Can you all hear that? Ringing continuously, the harp. And so Olivia turned to him and said, "Oh, Philip, you can't write the book. You're already in heaven." And Philip said, No, he said, "that's just a dream sequence beginning." He said, "Jews don't go to heaven. Jews pray for a long, extended dream sequence at the end of their lives." That dream sequence, I think, is what we call historical memory. That dream sequence is the collective memory of all of us who have read, will go on reading, and honoring the memory of Philip Roth. Thank you.
The challenge for me was to treat the present as history. The history of the present moment.
Roth next moved from the reinvention of a single man's history to reinventing the history of America itself by putting a Nazi sympathizer in the White House.
In 1940, there were people on the extreme right of the Republican Party who wanted to nominate the aviation hero Charles Lindbergh. But nothing ever came of it. I then thought, what if? What if they had nominated Lindbergh? As I imagined it, Lindbergh would have won. Roosevelt was going for a third term, which was taboo in American presidency. He was a polio victim. He was a crippled man. And I think if Lindbergh, with all his youth and charm and fame, had run for president in 1940, I think he might well have defeated Roosevelt.
Det här är inte Amerikas krig, förklarade Bengelsdorf. Och den stora publiken i Madison Square Garden svarade med applåder som varade i en hel minut. Det här, fortsatte rabbinen, är Europas krig. På nytt långvariga applåder. Det är ytterligare ett i den 1000 år långa raden av europeiska krig som går tillbaka till Karl den stores tid. Det är deras andra förödande krig på mindre än ett halvt århundrade. Och kan någon glömma de tragiska kostnaderna för Amerika efter deras förra stora krig? 40 000 amerikanska soldater dödade i strid. 192 000 amerikaner sårade. 66 000 amerikaner döda i sjukdomar. 350 000 amerikaner som uppbär invalidpension idag på grund av sitt deltagande i detta krig. Och hur astronomiskt kommer priset att bli den här gången? Hur stort antal döda, säg mig, president Roosevelt? Kommer det bara att fördubblas eller tredubblas eller kanske fyrdubblas? Säg mig, herr president Roosevelt, vilket slags Amerika kommer den väldiga slakten av oskyldiga amerikanska pojkar att lämna efter sig? Jag vände mig av all min kraft mot hur judarna behandlas i Tyskland. Och på samma sätt vänder sig överste Lindbergh mot hur de behandlas. Men hur skulle detta grymma öde som drabbat dem i deras eget land kunna lindras av att vår stora nation går ut i krig mot deras plågoandar? Jag är jude, och som jude upplever jag deras lidande med en skärpa som om de tillhörde min egen familj. Men jag är amerikansk medborgare, mina vänner. Nya applåder. Jag är född och fostrad till amerikan, och därför frågar jag er, hur skulle min plåga kunna minskas om Amerika gick med i kriget? Och sönerna i våra judiska familjer tillsammans med sönerna i våra protestantiska familjer och sönerna i våra katolska familjer skulle komma och stupa i 10 000-tal på Europas bloddränkta slagfält. Hur skulle min plåga kunna minskas om jag blev tvungen att trösta mina egna församlingsmedlemmar? Vad i helvete är det frågan om? Började pappa gorma. Varför i helvete gjorde han det där? Vad var det för ett idiotiskt tal? Tror han att en enda jude kommer att gå och rösta på den där antisemiten på grund av det där idiotiska, lögnaktiga talet? Är han inte riktigt klok? Vad tror han egentligen att han håller på med? Han gör Lindbergh-korser, sa Alvin. Han gör Lindbergh-korser för alla gojim. Vadå korser? Sa pappa, upprörd över att Alvin verkade prata sarkastiskt nonsens i ett ögonblick av så stor förvirring. Vad menar du? Jo, men han var inte där för att tala till judarna. Det var inte därför de köpte honom. Fattar du inte? Frågade Alvin med ett glödgat raseri över det han tolkade som den dolda sanningen. Han var där för att tala till alla gojim. Han gav gojim i hela landet sitt personliga tillstånd som rabbin att rösta på Lindy på valdagen. Fattar du inte vad de har fått den store Bengelsdorf att göra, farbror Herman? Han har just garanterat Roosevelts förlust.
Thank you, Johan Rabeus. Last week, I visited 3 stores for used books here in Stockholm. And I asked the people behind the counter, who reads Philip Roth these days? And they all said the same thing, more or less. Men, old men, like you. One said he recently tried to get more people interested, young people, so one of his shop windows was full of Philip's books, but it had no effect whatsoever. I hope the 3 shop owners are here tonight, because soon Lisa Halliday will talk about the significance of Philip Roth for younger readers. She's a freelance editor and translator based in Milan, Italy, and an author. And her novel Asymmetry is right now being translated into Swedish. And as she herself puts it, it was inspired by her close relationship to Philip Roth. In other words, it's not an autobiography, but a novel. And this we will also talk about. Please give Lisa a warm welcome. Okay. So, Lisa, how would you attract young readers? What is the recipe?
To the work of Philip Roth. Well, I should first say that I feel a little bit fraudulent being here and speaking on behalf of younger readers, in part because I'm 42, which does not make me exactly dewy, but also because by the time I met Philip, I had read some of his work, but I was very young. I was only 21 or 22. I was working at his literary agency, and that's when we met. And so much of my own experience reading him as a young person was affected, of course, by knowing him as well. It's not possible to know someone and to read his work without that informing your impressions of the work. So I can't speak as a generic younger reader, and for that reason, I actually did a bit of research. I interviewed a young woman who works at my own publishing house. I asked her, specifically because she had come to a reading of mine with a friend of hers, I asked her to tell me what she thought about Philip Roth. And the reason I chose her is because after my reading, she and her friend came up to me, and her friend said, I love Philip Roth's work. And they're in their 20s, so I thought, I'll ask them. And it was so wonderful to hear what she said. She sent me an email in which she said that it's precisely that he is unapologetic that is so refreshing, especially now. His humor, of course, is raucous and it's obscene, but it's complex. And she said that especially in these times when it can also feel a little bit dirty to read Philip Roth, because his protagonists don't always align with what people describe as the right morality to have today, she said it's in a way liberating to read him. And it's undoubtedly a dot that connects previous dots to the dots of today in literature. If you haven't read Philip Roth, you can't connect the dots from Dreiser and Hemingway and Sherwood Anderson to today. So I was really very happy to hear this impression from her, because it allows me to give you a little bit of context for my own impressions, which are much more specific and specific to our relationship.
But when we talked, you mentioned a few specific things that you think would appeal to younger readers, and one was the freedom.
Yes. The magical combination that Philip had, among others, was the freedom in choosing a subject and the rigor that he applied to expressing that freedom, the freedom of subject. That's something that I've taken to heart when I write. It's something that I think many writers now could benefit from as well, because it's not enough simply to write about a subject freely. There has to also be discipline. There has to be the rigor of the sentence structure even as you try to bend that sentence structure to capture the innuendo, the fluidity of modern life. And Philip did that beautifully.
And another thing that you mentioned that I remember from our conversation was there is an absurd dimension in his books.
Yes.
Say more about that.
Yes, well, I'm not the first, and I won't be the last tonight to comment on just how funny Philip was, and that's not going to change. I don't think he's only funny to older readers. He's funny to younger readers as well. We are underestimating younger readers if we assume that they don't get the jokes. I know so many young people who love his work, who do find it a little bit difficult to reconcile it with the moral climate of today.
Say more about that.
Well, I hesitate because one must be very careful, of course. There are many accusations flying around, specifically with respect to power dynamics between men and women. What Philip captured so well was that these are so much more nuanced than people tend to make them out to be. They're nuanced, they're complicated. Power fluctuates between people. No relationship is perfectly equal, and he would be the first to say that it's not always so as imbalanced as one thinks it is. So the current climate, of course, of Me Too is one that I find very problematic. And again, one must be very, very careful not to say the wrong thing. But I think that actually it is informative to read Philip's work in this climate. I think that Philip's work will survive for many, many years as an example of, again, the nuance of relationships and the passion that people have for each other. And as Adam said, this is not something that is of minor consideration to people. It's a preoccupation for everyone.
So, but when you mention absurd, the absurd dimension, would you say that is a quality in itself, or is it always part of something bigger? Is it also part of the master plan, the story?
I think it was just, Philip's sense of humor was so generous. It was in a way a form of survival. He made the intolerable aspects of life tolerable, not just tolerable, but fun, pleasurable with his jokes. If you were on the phone with him, and he sensed that a joke was needed to bring some levity to a situation because you were telling him about something sad that had happened to you, you could almost hear him through the phone thinking, a joke is needed here. It was essential. It was a way of being kind to people. It was a way of making life wonderful, when often it isn't. So I can't really speak to whether it was some kind of master aesthetic plan, but it is so much of what we love about his work. It makes us laugh, very simply.
Okay, I want to go back to the conversation we had, because you told me that when you met in 1998, you were 22, and you had read him. Years before, a boyfriend of yours, his mother, gave you Portnoy's Complaint to read. Tell us more about that.
I majored in art history. I did not major in literature, and I was not very well read. And my Jewish boyfriend's mother came to visit us at university, and she was reading American Pastoral. She said, "Have you heard of Philip Roth?" I said, "No." She said, "You must read him. He's wonderful." And the next thing I knew, she had bought me and given me as a gift Portnoy's Complaint. There are so... It almost seems to me sometimes a rumor that I cannot confirm that women have difficulty with Philip's work, because I know so many women who love his work. Indeed, a Jewish mother who gave it to her son's girlfriend. And yes, then I met Philip a couple of years after that when I first started working at his agency.
Okay. So after you had been together for a while, you gave him a short story of yours to read, published in the Paris Review. That must have been a daring move. What happened?
Well, he knew I was writing, and I think he was curious about it. And after the story was published, first I should say I called him very excitedly to tell him that they had accepted the story. And he said, "That's wonderful, we started out in the same place," which was very generous of him. And then when the story was published, I gave him a copy of it published in the magazine, and he read it for the first time. And he called me and he said, "You can do this. He said, if you're not afraid of the work, you can do it. And of course, to hear that from him was pivotal, to say the least.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you told me the story over the phone, what he said, if you are willing to work very hard.
He said, if you're not afraid of the work, you
okay,
can
if
do
not
it,
afraid
yes.
of the work. But when you told me the story, it really had some sort of existential ring to it. And the question is, do you think he paid a high price? I mean, certain things did not happen in his life, like children. And when you met him, he was 65 and he was still working very hard. So would you say that, he paid a high price?
I emphasized when we spoke that his example of working very hard made a very strong impression on me. It taught me that, yes, it is very useful to have talent, a certain amount of natural ability, but so much of the job of writing is showing up every day, putting in the hours, even when you don't feel well, even when you were out too late the night before, even when the only thing that you produce over the course of 5 hours is one sentence that you're happy with, or 0 sentences. Knowing Philip, hearing him at the end of a day speak about the misery of his day, how difficult it had been to produce a tiny piece of writing that he was pleased with, it made me realize that if I tried writing and it was very hard, maybe I was on the right track. And that's very encouraging to hear from someone like him, someone who's already published so many books, that it is so hard, it pushes you forward. It makes you think, maybe I can do this as well. I don't mean to sound too grand. Of course, I've only written one novel. So, yes, it made a very strong impression on me. I was aware of the fact that he did not have children. This is something that we discussed frequently. He had many, many friends with children. He encouraged me to have my daughter, and I believe he loved her. He wanted photos of her all the time. She was, I think, 10 months when he died, and almost every day I wished that he were still here to see her growing older. I wish I could still send him pictures of her. I think that he did, on some days, regret not having children, missing out on that. He did once refer to it to me as something that he missed out on. But I think also he understood that it couldn't be any other way if he were also to produce the amount of work that he produced. We don't know, because Philip Roth with children is one of the many counter lives that we can only imagine.
So he gave you advice. Would you say, in addition to that, he was some sort of mentor?
He was absolutely a mentor. I mean, in a very intimate way, because unlike other people here, I only knew him for the last 20 years of his life. And yet, my desire to write, my ambition to write, he took it so seriously. He always seemed to think that if I put in the time, the effort, it would happen. And you need people like that, never mind if they're Philip Roth. He spoke to me at such length about what I was working on. He suggested books for me to read. I didn't give him the manuscript of my novel until I had shown it to a few other people. It was a complete draft was finished. I'd showed it to my husband and a couple of other friends. And the time that he took to consider it so seriously, so generously, was just the greatest gift. Now, was he also perhaps occasionally annoyed that there was a character in it that many people would associate with him? I'm sure he was. But this is part of what was so wonderful. He was just a very, very generous, complex human who was able to combine, his desire to help with fiction writing, with writing, something that he felt so strongly about, had such high standards about, that seemed to override everything else.
So would you say that it was an advantage to write this novel in Italy?
Absolutely, because I knew that people would associate this character with Philip, and as you've emphasized, thank you very much, it is a novel. There are many things in this novel that never happened to me, many things that Ezra Blazer says and does that Philip Roth never said or did, and yet I knew that there would be a certain amount of attention related to it because people knew that I knew Philip. Living in Italy allowed me to write almost as though I were anonymously taking this on. The geographical distance created a kind of psychological distance, and Philip got this, and he encouraged me. He said, run with that freedom, use that sense of liberation to focus on the best story that you can write. And it was wonderful to be able to forget the world of New York publishing, the world of London publishing, where my husband used to work, and to feel that I was in a vacuum, allowed simply to focus on the quality of the work.
Okay. So was it an advantage to write it before Me Too?
Yes, I suppose it was, yes. The Me Too movement was articulated in this very prominent way after the book was written, and yet before the book was published. It was clear once it became articulated in this prominent way that the book would be seen through this lens. I personally do not see the Me Too movement as all that relevant to my book. The characters are together in a very consensual way. They enjoy mutual companionship. This speaks to what I was saying earlier. No relationship is perfectly symmetrical. Relationships are, by nature, asymmetrical. It's our differences that attract us to each other, the friction that results from those differences that make us excited about each other and that make us want to be with different people. The power between the couple in my book fluctuates. He trades it with her. And of course, this is what we love about literature. The lens through which we read literature changes with the times. So it's inevitable that people would read the book through this lens. I should say that the second part of the book is about something very different. It's about an Iraqi-American man trapped in an airport. It's inevitable not to read that. It's inevitable that one would read that through the lens of President Trump's attempt to ban Muslims from traveling. But anyway, this is what we love about literature. The words stay the same, but books have a capacity to change their meaning over time.
Okay. So your novel Asymmetry got rave reviews, very good reviews. Are you right now working on a new novel?
Yes, I'm working on a book that actually I was very lucky to discuss with Philip at length. I haven't been working on it very much recently because I have a young baby and because I've been traveling a lot for the current book. But I did discuss with Philip at length the next one, which will be set partly in Italy, and it will explore something that he was preoccupied with as well. I think most fiction writers are, and that is the tension between autobiography and fiction, the tension between truth and fiction, the nature of truth, and it will probably involve a bit of conversation about conspiracy theories and an Italian term, dietrologia, which literally means the study of what's behind.
Great. We're waiting for it. Thank you very much,
you.
Lisa. And ladies and gentlemen, now we will listen to the members of the Symphony Orchestra of the Royal College of Music. Give them an applaud. Thank you very much. We have listened to Sergei Prokofiev, Classical Symphony, Opus 25, the first movement, Allegro. Thank you very much. Our next guest is Judith Thurman, author of biographies of Karen Blixen and Colette, a staff writer at The New Yorker for almost 20 years, specializing in cultural criticism. In the course of our mail conversation, she proposed 3 different titles for her speech, and I really liked them all. The first one was The Words of a Man. The other one was Philip's Demons. And the third one, this is my favorite, The Elephant in the Living Room. Wow! Please give Judith a warm welcome.
I've never sat
Young people
inside
have learned to think by reading the exploits of Portnoy and his complaints.
And then up on the stage, when he gave you the medal, he whispered to me when he put it on, he says, you're not slowing down, are you? I said, I am indeed slowing down.
I've never been inside an orchestra before. It's an extraordinarily wonderful experience. I am really honored and moved and also a bit grieved to be in Stockholm with you. I wasn't quite prepared for the darkness, but it feels right to me, the light ebbing to its nadir and tolerance ebbing toward its nadir too, it would seem. It has been that kind of year. Had Philip not died in May and had a scandal not disrupted the proceedings, a scandal we don't need to dwell upon except perhaps to quote Rachel Donadio in The Atlantic, who wrote, "Somewhere Philip Roth must be laughing." The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2018 would today have been awarded to almost anyone other than Philip Roth. Philip took the high ground in his pronouncements, which were measured. On that principle, I originally intended to ignore the elephant in the living room, elefanten i vardagsrummet. It's a tonal language. But questions of high and low and of the sayable and the taboo seem apt for a Roth tribute. He of all people knew that we are venal creatures whose various selves, the sexual self and the social self, refuse to acknowledge one another on the street. He might also have reminded us that there are surely more elephants in living rooms around the world, quite a few of them Jewish, than there are left in the wild. I presume most of us feel that Roth was cheated of the Nobel, but how did Philip feel about it? He never wrote for gain, tangible or intangible, and less for celebrity. That was his hair shirt from the time Portnoy was published, and wherever you went with him, even as an old man, he was still getting winks and nudges, and the references to liver never died away. He actually came to regret having written it, he said to some of his friends not long ago. Yet there are certain novels, Portnoy is one, as is Sabbath's Theater, Story of O is another, and Elena Ferrante's Troubling Love is a fourth, that free you to imagine anything, which is to say, everything about yourself that you most fear to imagine. It's not that Philip didn't have a healthy esteem for his own accomplishments. In the last few years of his life, he reread his entire oeuvre, 31 volumes, with pleasure and pride, amazed as one sometimes is that one could have written such a sentence, and where did it come from, and who was that person? But he did have an autoimmune response to vanity. The self-importance of certain certified great writers always amused him. Of one, he said, having fixed us up in his perennial though futile efforts to find me a decent boyfriend, he's losing a valiant battle with his narcissism. And if he felt a twinge of complacency in himself, he did what white cells do to an infection: surround the contaminant and obliterate it, in his case with self-mockery. In Flaubert's Dictionary of Received Ideas, there's a charming entry on official decorations. It reads thus: Legion of Honor, Medal of Thee, to be scoffed at, even though you rather covet one. I dare say that is more or less how Philip felt about the Nobel. One of his small self-indulgences was to complain, in jest, though not entirely, about the inconveniences of getting to Stockholm. He would have to take an air ambulance, he protested, since a 10-hour flight with his wretched back and faulty heart was terrifying to contemplate. Let's Google jet charters, I once suggested, and we did. It was $200,000 round trip. You can afford it, I encouraged him, especially with the prize money. Honey, he said, you're forgetting that I'm the guy who balked at letting you hail a taxi for me on a bitter night in the rain because it was going in the wrong direction on 3rd Avenue. Entertaining the prospect of a jet was simply that, entertainment. It's true that Philip usually made plans to lie low on the day of the announcement, but mostly because he dreaded the condolences. And he joked about that too. It was another Pesach in October, he said once, the yearly Roth Passover. But he left the indignation to his friends, and on the morning after a Roth Pesach, I'm not sure which one, I think it was Elfriede Jelinek, he called me to say without preliminaries, I'm so sorry for your loss. The unctuous voice and the faux tragic intonation were exquisitely those of a rabbi from New Jersey. These jokes were private, and I can only recall one public comment from Philip about the Nobel Committee's anyone but Roth policy. Last year, David Remnick asked him what he thought of Dylan being called to the Bima, and Philip replied, it's okay, but next year I hope they give it to Peter, Paul, and Mary. One answer to the question, did Philip care, is which Philip? The son of Herman and Bess Roth would have thought of them with ardent filial love at the Stockholm Concert Hall and imagined them basking in the nachas of a Nobelist in the family, even if it wasn't a Nobelist in medicine. The young writer publishing his first stories probably considered the Nobel a remote Everest he might conquer one day. And in 1958, at 25, when Philip was writing Goodbye Columbus, Pasternak won, Boris Pasternak, a heartening precedent for the dissidents whom Roth would later champion in Writers from the Other Europe. Not that his heroic efforts to publish censored work and rescue oppressed writers counted for much with the Nobel Committee. Pasternak, by the way, initially refused the prize because he feared Soviet retaliation. Roth himself knew quite a bit about retaliation for powerful words that unsettle and provoke. He was Irving Howe's demonic apostate, the enemy of the Jews, the vulgar satirist whose mean-spirited work lacked the ennobling dimension of human community. Yet what may be noblest about Roth's work is its resistance to facile pieties like Howe's. The clip is coming, the segue. As all his obituaries pointed out, Philip won every major literary honor in the United States, some more than once. In 2011, he received the International Man Booker Prize, and I'm surprised that some of the critics who have chastised Philip's work on the grounds of its purported misogyny don't object to a literary prize called the Man Booker. There were foreign awards too, the Asturias Prize, the Weltliteraturpreis. The French made him a commander of the Legion of Honor. Poor Flaubert was only a chevalier. And President Obama, whom Philip loved, increasingly, as we all awoke every morning to another tweet storm of civic, grammatical, and moral degradation, awarded him the National Humanities Medal, which you just saw him get. And that is one of the images that I most cherish, of Philip laughing with Obama over a private joke at the ceremony. But I've often wondered if their joke was that Obama wasn't the King of Sweden. Here's the distinction. All these honors were rightly earned by and justly awarded to the fiction of Philip Roth, to individual novels in some cases, to the oeuvre in others, a life's work of 7 decades and 1 million or so irreducible sentences. Unlike other prizes, however, we know perfectly well that the Nobel wasn't withheld from the work of Philip Roth because its merit and stature were undeniable. The Nobel was refused to the man, or rather to the man who certain people, certain women in particular, supposed Roth to be. Now, I am a woman. I am a biographer of women. They are my specialty. I am a feminist unambivalently. In spite of certain Jacobin excesses, I vigorously support the Me Too movement. It's absolutely necessary. So I feel I have the credentials to correct certain misapprehensions about the friend whom I knew and loved for nearly 40 years. I have no intention of defending him because his character needs no defense. His characters need no defense either, though you may not like all of them. Indeed, you shouldn't, as per Philip's own intention. Inoffensive people didn't interest him much as a writer. Sane, sturdy women, perhaps even less so. He did have a weakness for the strayed and the wanton. So if you are a sane, sturdy woman who inhabits her head most of the time and perhaps are wary of dependence, and you go looking for your reflection in Philip's fiction, you won't find it easily. Some of the feminist resentment against him, I suspect, is tainted by a sense of rejection, even hurt romantic pride. But great literature is not a dating website. And you can have a visceral experience of connection, the intense sensation that a writer is both speaking to and seeing you, that transcends your gender or your personal insecurities, and in particular, those about being desirable. Roth's was the life of a man. That is how he lived, breathed, read, thought, made art and love. But what kind of man? If you confuse Philip with Roth and Roth with his characters, and yes, he does perversely sometimes invite that confusion, you will come away with a false and banal impression. He wrote upright, literally, at a standing desk, though figuratively too, and his notion of virtue in some respects was as keen as Jane Austen's. But where virtue is rewarded in her fiction, in his, it mostly comes to grief. The hungers of his anti-heroes are thwarted by their conscientiousness, and their conscientiousness is subverted by sex and death. Philip and I started talking about his death in 1983. It must have been early winter because he was still 49. We'd met for the first time some months earlier and we'd corresponded in the interim, but he waited for his next trip to New York to tell me some news in person, that his heart, as he put it, was almost shot. I was shocked by the change in his appearance, the radiant vigor he had projected, even bristled with, and his supreme playfulness, that gift for complicity which he tested you for at the beginning of a friendship, then lavished upon you in its course, had been cowed by the only adversary that could take him down. Philip rebounded, of course, as he would from other illnesses and depressions. At times it seemed supernaturally like those outsized rapscallions in the tales of Leskov. Philip's vitality was so fierce it was almost comedic, if you understand comedy as Leskov, Chekhov, Balzac, Kafka, Flaubert, and Roth himself did. The comedy of wrongness, the comedy of unhappiness, the comedy of angst, the comedies of lust, marriage, hypocrisy, ambition, piety, loneliness, betrayal, and deception. The comedy of tragedy, for that matter. It's all error, Zuckerman concludes at the end of I Married a Communist. There's only error, there's the heart of the world. Now, it is not the task of a writer to correct those errors, that heart disease of the world, but to make literature of them, and here we should consider the verb to objectify. since it has so often been used to damn Roth for misogyny. Objectify enters the lexicon rather late, in 1836, and it has two meanings, which are related, though paradoxically. The first is ubiquitous in modern commentary on gender, to turn something or someone, usually female, into an object, to deprive her of her subjectivity. The second definition is to render objective, and to illustrate that usage, I'd like to quote Dr. Ruth Hubbard, someone no one's heard of. She was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, born in Vienna, and she became the first tenured female professor of biology at Harvard. She died 2 years ago at 92. She made important discoveries as a scientist, but in middle age she turned to feminist activism. And what she thought of Philip, if anything, I couldn't discover, but she writes this: without words to objectify and categorize our sensations and place them in relation to one another, we cannot evolve a tradition of what is real in the world. A tradition of what is real in the world is a wonderfully nuanced substitute for that useless noun, reality. It also seems like a pertinent reflection on a writer's vocation. Philip Roth's fiction does not objectify women. It renders them objective according to his own traditions, familial, generational, temperamental, and literary, of what is real. As for Philip the man, that champion of women's writing, of mine, of Claudia's, of Lisa's, Mary Carr's, Maile Malloy's, Louise Erdrich, Hermione Lee, Julia Pierpont, Veronica Gang, Janet Hobhouse, Janet Malcolm, Edna O'Brien, the list goes on and on. That champion of women's writing, let me tell you this about him. There were more than a dozen remarkable women grieving at his deathbed, ranging in age from 26 to 87, half of them former lovers, the eldest going back more than half a century with him, and each of them her own subject. Because we had been so real to him, we were realer to ourselves. It was an honor to be Philip's friend, but there was a steeliness to him, a leanness of feeling. His affections weren't flabby. That sternness could be intimidating, though it was something you got used to in times by standing up to it, which he appreciated. You see it in his portraits, but what you don't see in them is the tenderness. It was Philip you turned to at your worst moments, and he came to your rescue. He talked you through your crises of indecision, but without ever dictating your choices. There were struggling young people whom he supported with wisdom and money, lots of it, and friends of his generation who might not have survived their bereavements without him. There were despairing lovers whom he talked down from their ledges he had stood upon. On life and death matters, however, Philip always hung tough. In the hospital, toward the end, he woke up from a drugged sleep, uncertain of what was happening to him. "What do they call this?" he asked me. His gaze was like a searchlight. "They call it dying," I said. This seemed to satisfy him, both as an answer and as an act of friendship, because he smiled. Philip's life force was never more imperative than at the moment he surrendered it. "I want to live," he told us at the hospital, "but if I can't live, survive as myself, I'm ready to die, and you have to let me go, even speed it up." In that sovereign resolve, he was as lucid and unsentimental as he had always been as a writer. And when one of his doctors, an old friend, asked what else he could do for him, Philip said, "Keep them away now," they meaning us, his close friends, "because I have my work to do," by which he meant the work of death. It was Philip who first urged me to write about Colette, and when the biography was done, he surprised me with the gift, a manuscript page from one of her memoirs, written on her blue stationery in her voluptuous script. Almost all of the text was crossed out by a latticework of fine pen strokes, like the wires in a pane of safety glass. Those delisions were his message. "Kiddo, it will always be like this." Philip, like Colette, persevered for 8 decades, their powers waxing as they aged, but neither practice nor renown made it easier. A connoisseur of surgeons, Philip liked to imagine that had he been one, every operation would have consolidated his skill and his confidence. But he lamented, ours is the only profession in which it doesn't help to be an old hand. And nothing he achieved in literature ever dissipated his sense of vertigo while struggling with the first draft, or his conviction that the task was impossible. My own sense of impossibility is pathological, and Philip liked to tease me about it. "Poor you," he said during one of our periodic discussions of his demise. "You'll have to write a eulogy for me one day, and how you'll suffer. But it better be good." When I wrote parts of this eulogy last August, they were the only prose of mine in 4 decades that Philip didn't have the chance to read, to tear apart, and to improve. He expected you to be just as unsparing with him. He would give you the manuscript of a new book, then record your criticisms so he could replay them. As you spoke, he took notes on a yellow pad, and he might stop the tape to ask you to defend an opinion, but never to defend himself. And while Philip's talk, his wicked improv, he could be really wicked, could hold you spellbound, he listened like no one else. He listened with a primal urgency, the way you listen in the wilderness, alert to danger, yet elated to feel your senses doing what they had evolved for. And he read just as he listened, with the same vigilance and the same generosity. And in his reading and his listening and his presence, which I feel so strongly tonight, you were heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I forgot to mention that the music you will hear tonight, these are some of Philip Roth's favorites. Now we'll take a break and we'll have half an hour intermission, so please be back here at 9 o'clock. Thank you.
The 3 pillars of a possible anti-Semitism today, of a possible mass anti-Semitism, the 3 pillars are obsession of Israel, yes, denial of Holocaust, and competition of victims.
My favorite answer that I ever heard to the question, do you believe in God, was I'm agnostic in my answer, but I'm also agnostic about your question. Like, I'm not convinced that we could be talking about the same thing, you know? Like, if you ask me, do you believe in the God of biology and physics and chemistry, I'd say, sure. If you'd ask me, do you believe in a God who has a white beard and interferes in human affairs, I would say no.
Naja, und dieses Museum müsste in Berlin sein. Also irgendda, wo auch die schlimmsten Dinge gedacht wurden und programmiert wurden und nicht irgendwo es gibt auch Leute, die sagen, ja, wir hätten hier noch so ein altes Industriegebäude in einer kleinen Stadt oder wie. Nein, es müsste in Berlin sein und zwar an einem zentralen Ort, wo man weiß, da ist das. Also dieses Gewicht müsste es auch kriegen, das müsste auch die deutsche Politik wollen.
My name is Lizzie Scheja and I'm the director of Judith's Kultur i Sverige. We are extremely happy to be able to host this special program with Maestro Daniel Barenboim and the members of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra.
And then a certain Richard Wagner came and pushed the harmonic system to the extreme, and just before it broke, he stopped. That was Tristan and Isolde. And from then on, the only way was to do away with tonality, and we have the 12-tone system by Schubert, and there we have what then became the Central Committee of the Soviet Socialist Republic. Everybody is equal. Some more than others, but everybody is equal.
I've got my hands together, they are completely inseparable. And there have been occasions when Marta has been ill and had to be in hospital, and George Gotthard cannot compose, and he has to have her in the room. A lot of artists need to be alone when they're working and can't have any other human presence.
There is a huge swath of the political spectrum in both Europe and the United States, which is very consciously looping back to the 1930s and saying that the 1930s were a wonderful time. And when that's true, it's hard to ignore the 1930s. So it's explicit in Russia, it's explicit in the United States, where our presidential slogan is America First. America First is literally Deutschland über alles.
That some young members of young generation can live their life completely unaware that there are alternative ways of thinking. Now, the real dialogue is the dialogue with people who are not like-minded. You want to understand each other.
There are very, very few real and good stand-up comedians. I think of stand-up comedy as an art of betrayal, because what does the good?
Three pillars of a possible anti-Semitism today, of a possible mass anti-Semitism. The three pillars are obsession of Israel, yes, denial of Holocaust, and competition of victims.
My favorite answer that I ever heard to the question, do you believe in God, was I'm agnostic in my answer, but I'm also agnostic about your question. Like, I'm not convinced that we could be talking about the same thing, you know? Like, if you ask me, do you believe in the God of biology and physics and chemistry, I'd say, sure. If you would ask me, do you believe in a God who has a white beard and interferes in human affairs, I would say no.
Ja, und dieses Museum müsste in Berlin sein. Also irgendda, wo auch die schlimmsten Dinge gedacht wurden und programmiert wurden und nicht irgendwo es gibt auch Leute, die sagen, ja, wir hätten hier noch so ein altes Industriegebäude in einer kleinen Stadt oder wie. Nein, es müsste in Berlin sein und zwar an einem zentralen Ort, wo man weiß, da ist das. Also dieses Gewicht müsste es auch kriegen, das müsste auch die deutsche Politik wollen. Ja.
My name is Lizzie Scheja and I'm the director of
Warm welcome, as I said, to you, Masha. You come quite often to Sweden. Last time I saw was just last autumn in December when we.
You're implying I come too often.
No, I think you should emigrate. I think you should. I think you should live here. Actually, we would need you. We bumped into each other at a train. You en route to Malmö, and now you're here again. And I know that you could just tell us briefly before we start the actual conversation. I know you met two Swedish activists in the just couple of days that you've been here now. Who are they?
Well, I've met more than two Swedish activists. I've been reporting. You're putting me on the spot though, but no, I interviewed Greta, the young woman who's protesting for against climate change and for climate policy. And I met Leila.
Leila Ali Almi.
Who's a newly elected MP. It was her first day on the job, so that was very exciting. It was a terrific interview. And I've met other people too, but I'm not telling you all of it. You can read about it in the New Yorker.
Yeah. We're definitely going to do that, perhaps even in Dagens Nyheter, where we are happy to publish your columns sometimes as well. Last autumn, you were here to promote and talk about your book on Russia, The Future is History, which is a fascinating account on how totalitarianism reclaimed Russia and how the Homo Sovieticus is still alive and kicking, so to speak. But that was last autumn, and I happen to know that since you wrote this book, you also published 2 new books. Apart from this one that we're going to talk about today.
No, I've published 1 book since then.
Okay, and which one was that?
You Never Remember.
Never Remember, which is about the reluctance to remember in today's Soviet Union.
Today's Russia, yeah. It's a book that I did with a photographer, and the subtitle, it's called Never Remember, Looking for Stalin's Gulag in Putin's Russia. So we went to 3 places that I had reported from in the 90s, writing about the memorialization efforts. And we looked at what had happened over the last 20 years. In a sense, it's a companion book to The Future is History. If publishing were constituted a little differently, then I can imagine those 2 books being sort of sold together. It's like the photo album that goes with the big text.
And then there's also a new book. You haven't written 2 books, but there's also an old book out the recent years.
No, it came out a couple of years ago.
Okay,
yeah.
which is called Where
the
Jews Aren't.
Yeah,
but it's also connected in some way to this one about the.
It is a little bit, yeah. I mean, that book came out in 2015, I think, or 16. Yeah, it's a book about. Yeah, 2015. But I wrote it quite a few years before that. It's a book about Birobidzhan, which is the Jewish autonomous region in Russia. And it's kind of a rumination on the failure to create a place for the Jews in Russia. But it's also what really fascinated me about the Birobidzhan project and about autonomism as a movement was that autonomism, when it appeared in parallel to Zionism, seemed so much more rational. And I was fascinated with sort of tracing the story of that very reasonable argument that was posed in opposition to the utopian and crazy and irrational Zionist argument, and sort of looking at them 100 years later and looking at how the rationality appears from today's point of view.
Mm. So they're having done this just brief retrospect of the last year's production, you get the obvious impression that you're not lazy. You keep working.
I work a bit, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's kind of the impression I wanted to make here. So,
thank you for my reputation.
Tonight we're going to talk about and focus even further on this topic that you just touched upon here, and this is your latest book out in Swedish. That's right, anyway. But it was written quite a few years ago.
The book is as old as my daughter, who was just texting to me about the political situation in the United States and how she's worried about the possibility that Trump will fire the special prosecutor. So yeah, it's been, I was actually breastfeeding her in my lap and typing the book at the same time. So it's been a while since I wrote it.
So you wrote it like in 17 years ago.
That's correct, yeah.
And I'm just going to make my personal presentation about this, called Esther and Rusia, for those of you who cannot see it or haven't read the presentation for tonight's program. It's a story, personal story about your 2 grandmothers, Esther and Rusia. And the complete title is How My Grandmothers Survived Hitler's War and Stalin's Peace. And it's weaving together the stories of 2 grandmothers as they lived through the turmoil and terror of the first half of the 20th century. And personally, I have to say it's a very powerful reading experience.
Thank you.
I mean, I shan't say it's the best book you've written, because you've written so many and they're all very good, but it's definitely up there, Masha. It's very powerful read. I can strongly recommend that you read it. People sometimes say that it's a non-fiction book as exciting as a novel, but I mean this goes way beyond what you could imagine in a novel, actually. What happens here? Tell us just very briefly what happens. What is it about?
Well, the nice thing about nonfiction, of course, is that you can write about things as they actually happened, regardless of how unbelievable they are. It's. I mean, first of all, I'm really grateful to the Brombergs for bringing this book out. It's obviously an important book to me. And the way that this book happened was that I had left the Soviet Union when I was 14 years old with my parents. And then I came back as a correspondent 10 years later, and I sort of re-met my grandmothers. And I think that if I hadn't been separated from them for a decade, I probably wouldn't have found them as interesting. But I was getting their stories anew and in a very new way. And so there were certain things that I remembered from childhood, and there were certain things that they had never talked about when I was a child, until I started asking. So through the 90s, for a number of years, I interviewed them, and I got their stories. But my grandmothers are united not only by the fact that they're both my grandmothers, but they're also best friends. So my parents met as children. So there were these two women who had very closely intertwined lives, but very opposite lives, or at least that's how I thought. And the family mythology was that one of my grandmothers was this incredible rebel, and the other was a compromiser. And the book is really a book about the nature of collaboration. It's what people do in a society that gives them only bad choices, and how they try to remain whole in the face of these consistently horrible choices, and to raise children, and to maintain romantic relationships, and also to avoid compromising their own integrity. But in the middle of the book, there's to me, sort of the existential hero of the book is actually my great-grandfather, whom I never met, who died in Majdanek in 1943. And the story that my grandmother, his daughter, had always told me was that he was a hero of the resistance in the Białystok ghetto. And that's true. What she didn't mention, or she did, but kind of in a way that didn't signify. But when I went to Białystok to research the book, I found out that he was also the de facto leader of the Judenrat in the Białystok ghetto. So here was this man who played these two roles that seem to us, in sort of our contemporary understanding of history, to be absolutely contradictory. And there's no better story that you can come up with to examine the issue of collaboration than that. And so there's a chapter in the center of the book that deals with that and tries to unravel his motivation and how we can live with that knowledge.
We're going to come back to him later, I think. I just thought that you might give us some kind of common platform to stand on here, just presenting your two grandmothers. Who were they, and where were they born, and how did their life come to be?
So they were born in 1920 and 1923. So they were very much alive when this book was first written and published. They both died in the last 3 years. And one of them was born in Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, moved to Moscow when she was a small child, and was brought up in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. And the other was born in Białystok, in a wealthy family, where she was an only child, and she was being groomed. Białystok is in Poland, was and is now again in Poland. And she was being groomed to go to Israel when she grew up. Her father was a prominent member of the World Zionist Organization, and her mother was a Bundist, but she was going to acquiesce, and they were all going to move to Israel once she finished her studies. But she was born in 1923, so in 1939 she was still in high school when when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany partitioned Poland, and she ended up in the Soviet Union. So she applied to a university in Moscow instead of going to Jerusalem University, where her tuition had already been paid, and moved to Moscow. And then both of her parents were arrested by the Soviets, and her mother was exiled to Siberia, and her father was not. Her father was released from jail by the Germans when they came into Bialystok in June 1941, and then, of course, re-interned in the ghetto a couple of weeks later. And my other grandmother, the one who grew up in the Soviet Union, she lost her husband in the war when my mother was just 2 months old, and she had been educated to be a history teacher, but she came to the conclusion that she couldn't work as a history teacher in the Soviet Union because that would involve lying all the time. So she chose to be a censor. To her, it was a moral choice. But this talk about bad choices, right? Bad options. But she thought that censorship was a mechanical activity. Things were either allowed or not allowed. You crossed them out if they weren't allowed. There was a list of things. There was a register of things that couldn't be written about. Whereas teaching children was something that involved herself, right? She would have used her charm, her guiles, her body, her ability to be convincing to lie to children. That's very different to her from the job as a censor. So she was a censor, she was a member of the Communist Party, and I perceived her as someone who had always compromised. Whereas my other grandmother, when she ended up in Siberia during the war and the secret police tried to recruit her, she refused and risked her life, and it was all absolutely extraordinary. And so that was the family mythology. And of course, when I started researching it, it all turned out to be a little bit more complicated.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, I found out that my other grandmother, the rebel, had actually accepted a job with the secret police later. But here's what happened. So she graduated from university in Moscow in 1948 at the height of Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign, and she couldn't get a job. And she couldn't stay on in graduate school either because of the anti-Semitic campaign. And so finally she gets a job as a Hebrew translator at the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And some of you may know what the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was, but when she showed up for work, the place was sealed. Everyone had been arrested that morning. And she was terrified that she was going to get arrested, and then she did in fact get a phone call from the secret police telling her to come in. And so she was sure she was getting arrested, so she packed her things and went. You know, and this was a discovery for me that was one way to get arrested in the Soviet Union. They didn't always come for you in the middle of the night. Sometimes they just called you and you came. And so she came, and when she showed up at the headquarters of the secret police, they said, no. You don't need your clothes. You're actually here for a job interview. And it turned out that in the papers seized at the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, they found her personnel file, and they needed a translator from Hebrew because Israel had just been incorporated, and so they needed people who knew Hebrew. And there was a problem with that in the Soviet Union because the study of Hebrew had been effectively illegal now for a couple of decades. So she said, but how am I going to work for you? I have relatives abroad. And they said, well, everybody who knows Hebrew has relatives abroad. It's just they're also like 90, and here you are, a young woman. So she accepted the job after some soul searching. And then she failed her medical exam because she turned out to be blind in one eye, something that she didn't know.
As you can see, this book is so full of this kind of stories that really makes you wonder how much it's possible to fit into one life. What's the thing with grandmothers, I wonder? One Russian novelist, a colleague of yours, Sergei Lebedev, I read a quote by him. He said, like, my own two grandmothers were the most impressive figures of my childhood. Others, he said, like my mother, father, various relatives, were just regular people, like I am. My grandmothers, though, they were like pillars of the Soviet universe. So what's the thing about grandmothers in this system?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. First of all, grandmothers play a very important role in Russian families, right? With sort of the strange demographics of Russia, grandfathers are generally absent. And so by the time grandmothers reach grandmother status, they become matriarchs. They often are very involved in childcare. A lot of the time, children are partly or entirely brought up by grandmothers, right, while their parents work. This was especially true some years ago, I mean, not that many years ago, but before Russia's, the age at first birth precipitously rose a few years ago and became sort of European level. But up until about a decade ago, Russians were having children really early, and the grandmothers were stepping in. So I think that we all have like our grandmothers as an outsized influence, but also for people, I mean, I think Lebedev is a bit younger than I am, but for people of my generation, our grandmothers, if they survived, they had lived through so much. If they survived. And I mean, I think that my grandmother's stories are absolutely amazing, but I also had a very strong sense when I first went back to Russia that everybody should immediately go out and start interviewing their grandmothers. Because whoever actually had a grandmother, could see a century through a woman's eyes. And all these lives, they all involved feats of heroism and incredible deprivation, incredible hardship, and always some sort of triumph of the human spirit. And when I was reporting The Future is History, which is centered around the lives of 4 people of a much younger generation, I knew I didn't, when I was choosing my characters, I had certain criteria, but family history was not one of my criteria, because I knew that whoever I chose was going to have some sort of extraordinary grandmother story, no matter what their other circumstances were. And that turned out to be exactly true. Every single one of those characters has an extraordinary family history that illustrates both sort of resilience and the just incredible violence of the Soviet system.
It's also connected, of course, with the concept and the role of family in a society as the Soviet society. Could you describe why the family was so important in a totalitarian system like the Soviet?
So I think there are a couple of things. I think the family is important in any situation of hardship, right? I mean, with shortages and just an incredibly difficult daily life, unless you can rely on your kin, you're not going to survive. But on top of that, you have a political system that is intent on destroying every human being, right? In taking away their agency and taking away their integrity and taking away their sense of self. And one way, and possibly the most important way, to maintain a sense of one's self and a sense of private space and a sense of a place in the universe that is independent of this state that dominates everything, is to maintain family ties. And so there are a lot of things. I mean, the way that family functioned was in some ways almost automatic. If you had relatives and the relatives needed help, you didn't ask whether you'd ever met them before. You always opened your home to them. You know, and in some ways it's still the case. I mean, when I was living in Moscow up until a few years ago, a distant relative could call me from some other city and say, you know, my daughter is coming to Moscow to apply to university. Can she stay with you for 2 months? Yeah, of course. Yeah. No.
And also, this is tightly connected to another of the book's motives or themes, which is friendship. I mean, your two grandmothers, they become very close friends, and this is the only constant in life. I think you write at some occasion that empires fall, nations disappear, but a friend is still there.
Yeah, I mean, Russians, as again probably many of you know, have a very exalted view of friendship. And I think a lot of the things that I just said about family are also true about friends. It's your chosen family. And for me, I mean, in my experience, I think friends have become even more central than family. My friends in Moscow are still my reference point, even though we see each other now, with some of them a couple of times a year, and some of them I haven't seen in several years. And I think that was true for my grandmothers. They had a very strong sense of each other, but they also had a very strong sense of a small, constructed community, right? And this was, again, these were people whom you could always take for granted in the best sense of the word. Right? And I think that this is one of the greatest gifts that I was able to give my children, was that they grew up in a kind of friend community where their friends were my friends' children, and so they were always there. They didn't, you know, and that's how you grow up with a sense of foreverness, right? Which is something that either adulthood or emigration tends to take away, whichever comes first.
So there's a lot about the small life, the life that is very close to you, within you, and it's about family, it's about friendship, but it's also about love. And there are some very tragic moments here. One of your grandmothers, she's very much in love with a young man, and it's a very tragic ending to this love story. Could you tell us about this?
You mean my grandfather?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, meets this young man in May of 1941. And he's beautiful, he is brilliant, they fall madly in love, and the war starts in June 1941. The war, the war that's referred to as the war in the Soviet Union, which is of course when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. And immediately their lives are thrown into disarray, their parents leave Moscow. For a couple of months, they stay in Moscow alone, these kind of kids who are in love. She's, I think, 21, he's 23. And then they're evacuated. He was in the military law academy, so he was actually exempt from going to the front. And then he decided to volunteer, so he left. She was going to go with him. She knew German very well, so she was going to become an interpreter at the front. And then my great-grandmother, her husband's mother, came to say goodbye to them, took one look at her and said, "You're not going anywhere, you're pregnant." which is something that this young woman who was going to become my grandmother had not realized. And so she stayed and had a baby. And when the baby was 2 months old, she found out that her husband had been killed.
Totally, I mean, with no use, so to speak. He was one of these totally that was sacrificed by Stalin's strategy in the war to just use people like.
That's always the really difficult part about talking about the Soviet victory in World War II. It's something else that's exalted in Russia. It has become the foundational myth of contemporary Russia. And one of the ways in which contemporary Russian ideology lays claim to ownership of the victory in World War II is that the Soviet Union lost more, by far, many more people than any other country. Current estimates are about 27 million people died in World War II, compared to less than 1 million for the Americans. And so that great sacrifice is supposed to increase the value of this victory. But of course, the way that people were used was as cannon fodder. A lot of the time they weren't armed. They were just bodies. And it took a totalitarian state to be able to throw so many bodies into this meat grinder. And to use them, bodies as bodies to stop the German war machine. And I think that there are not a lot of people left in Russia. There were never a lot of people in the Soviet Union who were able to talk about the war effort like that and to grieve for people who died on the one hand in the name of a great victory and on the other hand quite meaninglessly, because those are two ideas that are very difficult to hold in your mind at the same time. But I think my grandmother understood that very well about her husband. And the role he played in the war was in the army. He was a communist party. He was a political leader, right, which was sort of the equivalent of a chaplain in the Soviet in the Red Army. He preached to the troops. He preached communist ideology. He had the right to sign people up for the Communist Party. And it was a very important ritual to do this induction into the party just before battle. It was supposed to make the men better soldiers, and it probably did. There was a kind of inspiration, a kind of belief that drove them. And so that was his job, and so he was literally on the front lines, going along, inducting people into the party, and got killed.
A very tragic moment when your grandmother gets well, I won't spoil the book, but it's a very strong and powerful moment in your story, because this is also fundamentally a very, very good story, as you all probably understand at this moment. Let's return to the theme of the Jewish history in this book, because if you haven't concluded that yet, both your grandmothers are Jewish, and one part of the story takes place in Białystok in Galicia, and where one of your grandmothers grow up or live. Yes, and between the First and Second World War, Białystok is an important Jewish cultural center. I think you write at some place that it had been for 500 years, and at some point more than half of the city's population is Jewish. And how many Jews are left today?
Well, when I was researching the book, I went to Białystok to work in the archives of the Białystok ghetto, and the archives keeper, he gave me what I needed to look at, and then I asked him, how many Jews still live in Białystok, and he said 1.5. And I said, well, how is that possible? And he said, well, one is Jewish.
Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for Portnoy. The novel that made Philip Roth famous and turned several rabbis and Jewish leaders against him in America and in Israel. This was 1969. When I, many years later, read about the reactions at the time, I felt very sorry for the author. People he respected said terrible things about the book. Gershom Scholem denounced it from Jerusalem. And in New York, the famous Irving Howe called it an empty story, a book lacking real content. Oy. Bernard Avishai is a writer and author, professor of government at Dartmouth College, resides both in Israel and the US, writes on a regular basis for The New Yorker, and was a friend of Philip Roth, and even wrote a book about this novel. He will now be our guide to Portnoy. Please give Bernie a warm welcome.
And it was a sensation. It was an experience unlike any I was ever to know in the future, and unlike anything that had happened to me in the past. Because this was a scandal. Nothing in my education prepared me to be a scandalous writer. I thought I was going to be a serious writer. But the moment I became comical and freewheeling in this way, I became a scandalous writer.
This hero is not just some miserable wretch writhing in his lusts. He is the Jew avenging himself of his upbringing in a Jewish home, which has become detestable to him, by going out and laying shiksas, thereby freeing himself from the nightmare of Mama. This is the book for which all anti-Semites have been praying. I dare say that with the next turn of history, this book will make all of us defendants at court. We will pay the price, not the author who revels in obscenities.
You know, Irving Howe's name has been raised here a couple of times, and I have to say I was very fond of him. I was very close to Irving Howe. After he had reviewed Portnoy's Complaint in Commentary magazine in 1972, I remained very close to him. I used to sleep at his house in New York and then go have dinner with Philip at night and come back. And what Irving had done in that review, he started it off by saying that the cruelest thing one could do with Portnoy's Complaint was read it twice. And I used to tell him, why would you reread it when the first time was unforgettable? And back when the book was published, exactly 50 years ago, I knew people who sat around in coffee shops and student unions and living room floors reading the entire book out loud to one another. Its characters became instant archetypes. Sophie, especially Sophie, the monkey, my father, cousin Heshy, Rabbi Warshaw, Dr. Spielvogel. We laughed and teased and blushed. Only Portnoy wasn't laughing. Who in the history of the world has been least able to deal with a woman's tears? My father, I am second. He says to me, you heard your mother, don't eat French fries with Melvin Weiner after school. Or ever, she pleads. Or ever, my father says. Or hamburgers out, she pleads. Or hamburgers, he says. Hamburgers, she says bitterly, just as she might say Hitler, where they can put anything in the world they want and he eats them, Jack. Make him promise before he gives himself a terrible tzura and it's too late. I promise, I scream, I promise, and race from the kitchen. To where? Where else? I tear off my pants furiously. I grab that battered battering ram to freedom, my adolescent cock. Even as my mother begins to call from the other side of the bathroom door, now this time don't flush. Do you hear me, Alex? I have to see what's in that bowl. Doctor, do you understand what I was up against? My wang was all I had that I could call my own.
Men du hör inte vad jag säger. Jag tror inte på Gud. Jag tror inte på judarnas religion och ingen annan religion heller. Det är bara lögn. Alltihopa. Jaha minsann. Det är det. Jag tänker inte bära mig åt som om det var något särskilt med de där helgdagarna när det inte är det. Och jag menar det. Ja, för herr Stöddig så är det kanske inget särskilt med de där. För att han inte vet något om dem. Vad vet du om Rosh Hashanas historia? Vad vet du? Vet du en sak, eller kanske två, vet du? Vad vet du om judarnas historia? Eftersom du kan kalla deras religion som har dukt åt folk, som har varit bra mycket klyftigare än du och bra mycket äldre än du i 2000 år, som gör att du kan kalla allt detta lidande och all deras smärta för lögn. Ja, men det finns ingenting som en gud. Det har aldrig funnits det heller. Jag är hemskt ledsen. Men i min ordlista så kallas det för lögn. Jaha, men vem var det då som skapade världen, Alex? Frågar han föraktfullt. Den råkade väl bara bli till då, om jag får tro dig. Alex, säger min syster. Det enda pappa menar är att även om du inte vill gå med honom så kunde du väl i alla fall byta kläder. Men varför då, skriker jag. För någonting som aldrig har existerat. Varför ber ni inte mig gå ut och byta kläder för ett kattkräks eller ett träds skull? Ja, de existerar ju åtminstone. Den lärde allvetaren har inte svarat på min fråga än, säger far. Försök inte byta ämne. Vem skapade världen? Och människorna? Ingen? Ja, just det, pappa. Ingen. Åhå, kan man tänka sig, säger far. Det är snillrikt, väldigt snillrikt. Jag är glad att jag inte har gått i high school. Om det är så snillrik man blir av att göra det. Alex, säger min syster, och mjukt som hon brukar mjukt. För hon är redan en smula knäckt hon också. Om du bara kan ta på dig ett par skor. Men du är ju lika knasig som han är, Hanna. Om det inte finns någon gud, vad spelar det då för roll med skorna? En enda dag om året ber man honom om en tjänst, men det är han för märkvärdig för. Så är det med den saken, Hanna. Så är det med din bror, hans respekt och hans kärlek. Men pappa, nej, men han är en bra pojke, pappa. Han har visst respekt för det. Han tycker ju visst om dig. Och judarna då? Hur är det med judarna då? Nu skriker han och fäktar med armarna eftersom han hoppas att det ska hindra honom från att brista i gråt. Ordet kärlek behöver nämligen bara viskas i vårt hus för att allas ögon redan ska börja svämma över. Judarna, har han någon respekt för dem? Va? Lika mycket som för mig, precis exakt lika mycket. Och plötsligt ilsknar han till. Han vänder sig mot mig med en ny och lysande tanke. Skulle min högt bildade son vilja tala om för mig? Vill du tala om för mig en sak? Vet du någonting om Talmud? Vet du någonting om historia? 1, 2, 3 så var du bar mitzva, och det var slutet på all religionsundervisning för din del. Vet du att det finns sådana som studerar den judiska religionen i hela sitt liv, och när de dör så är de ändå inte färdiga. Så tala nu om för mig, du som är helt färdig med judendomen nu när du är 14. Vet du ett enda dugg om sagan? Om ditt folks underbara historia och arv? Redan rinner dock tårarna ner för kinderna på honom, och flera är på väg från ögonen. Stort A. Stort A i skolan, säger han. Men när det gäller livet, då är han lika okunnig som den dag han föddes. Nu tycks det. Det tycks som om tiden till sist är inne. Så jag säger det. Det är någonting som jag har vetat sedan en tid tillbaka. Jag säger det. Pappa, det är du som är okunnig. Du, pappa. Tack.
I must say, it's always a little hard coming down from a reading of Portnoy's complaint. When I wrote a book about it, I remember thinking that people will like to read a book about Portnoy's complaint about as much as they would like to see their cousins' photos of Prague. And so we go on. So we remember Portnoy stabbing pitilessly at mothers, plugged up fathers, dizzying shiksas in heat. We remember Portnoy erupting on the analyst's couch the way we might, as if we could really imagine, let alone afford the analyst's couch. Let's get this out of the way. Actually, Judith already did, that you can get intelligent aging people to laugh out loud just by saying the words Alex and liver. What most bothered Irving Howe was Portnoy's mockery of his bourgeois Jewish family, though. And this was immediately assumed to mean Jews in general, which in 1969 seemed especially brazen, chutzpahdik. It was only 27 years after 1942 and 21 years after 1948. American Jews thought that they had earned a kind of moral intermission, one Portnoy seemed not to be respecting. It was also just 2 years after the 1967 war, which had made diaspora Jews and organized American Zionists inarguably, now unimaginably, cool. Portnoy's sexual angst suggested that Jews were anything but cool. You put the id back in yid, Portnoy instructed, and you come to understand the oi in goy. So Roth, through Portnoy, seemed the satirist par excellence, particularly of the American Jewish community. I mean, Portnoy had such a mouth on him, so subtle, so schmutzig. Worse, he seemed so smart. He gave Western literature probably its greatest alliteration, publicly pleasing my parents while privately pulling my putts. Roth's early stories, collected in Goodbye Columbus, had already proven the menace of his wit. Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Rachman, who later became president of Bar-Ilan University, wrote that if Roth wanted to point out problems with the Jewish community, he ought to have published in a Jewish periodical, or better, in Hebrew. What is being done to silence this man? Rachman wrote to the Anti-Defamation League. Medieval Jews would know what to do with him. So Roth had reasons to retaliate. When I first met Philip Roth in 1974, he said that rabbinic bullies like Rachman had in a way liberated him to write Portnoy's complaint. Okay, I thought, you want to fight? Let's fight. It all seemed clear enough, didn't it? Didn't the narrating Portnoy, under the cover of the psychoanalytic couch, make public and intensify Roth's own sexual lusts and views of Jews? Wasn't Portnoy Roth? No, it did not. No, he was not. A novel in the form of a confession is, for God's sake, not a confession in the form of a novel. For Roth, the laugh is on Portnoy too, especially on Portnoy, on the rhetoric of a frantic, sexually tortured young man trying to make sense of his origins in the partial, mocking way children do about parents and relatives. A man tormented because he stopped liking the people he loves. Yes, our hero sees what's grotesque, what's repressive, and it drives him crazy. But that's precisely because he feels sexually pathetic and his affection for his family is so strong. Roth taught the book at Bard College and shared his lecture notes with me. The greatest object of the satire, he writes, is the narrating Portnoy. Listen, Portnoy. The hysteria, the superstition, the watch-its and the be carefuls. You mustn't do this, you can't do that, hold it, don't, you're breaking an important law. Oh, and the milchiks and fleischiks, besides, all those Meshuggah rules and regulations on top of their own private craziness. It's a family joke that when I was a tiny child, I turned from the window out of which I was watching a snowstorm and hopefully asked, Mama, do we believe in winter? The pathos is delicious. And when you think about it, the indecency Portnoy feels is not really about sex. It's about the loss of self-possession, letting go, the loss of self-possession, the ultimate bourgeois possession. Roth's point, which he wrote about in his wonderful essay of 1974, which he wrote in the New York Review of Books, Imagining Jews, is that Jews no more than other humans could fight successfully against, quote, the non-negotiable demands of crude antisocial appetite and vulgar aggressive fantasy. Portnoy's honesty seemed indecent because American Jews had become something like the poster children, the exemplars, the poster children for the kind of restraint and public decorum that the word bourgeois conveyed. In post-war America, Hollywood served up images of Jewish lawyers and doctors, big shots, who keep their heads while others didn't. Who else but Jews might show the way? Who, if not a white-bearded rabbi, marched with Dr. Martin Luther King? Elizabeth Taylor and Sammy Davis Jr. went down into crisis and came up converted. It was a Jewy soda fountain owner who lamented the violence afflicting the sharks and the jets. Remember from West Side Story, the sharks and the jets. Why can't you kids just get along? Why can't you get along? Jews controlled themselves so well, partly because they had been a scorned minority and had learned to ingratiate themselves, but also, as little Alex had intuited, because Jews had a religious culture that could seem a divine restraining order. What else, I ask you, were all those prohibitive dietary rules and regulations all about to begin with, doctor? What else but to give us little Jewish children practice in being repressed? Practice, darling, practice, practice, practice. Why else the 2 sets of dishes? Why else the kosher soap and salt? Why else, I ask you, but to remind us 3 times a day that life is boundaries and restrictions. If it's anything, hundreds of thousands of little rules laid down by none other than none other. Thus, the American embodiment of self-restraint cannot restrain himself, at least not in private, where lovers and analysts learn the truth. Needless to say, a great many critics, not just Howe and Gershom Scholem, didn't really get it. I mean that the joke was meant to be especially on Portnoy because Portnoy was no more than a young man. Moreover, Portnoy's honesty about his brazen, guilty, frustrated sexual hungers would not only not provoke anti-Semitism, but was a kind of announcement that American Jews had arrived. Curiously, Portnoy's complaints' very aggression seemed to drain sentiments that had pooled around the pretensions of our Anti-Defamation League. No, we were not all Bernard Malamud's saints. For us, too, sexual junk was lurking under moral righteousness. Portnoy in Tel Aviv whines to his Zionist dish, Naomi, who accuses him of being a self-hating Jew. Ah, but Naomi, maybe that's the best kind. You could almost hear our non-Jewish friends sighing with relief. None of this would have worked had the psychoanalytic room not been convincingly enigmatic, leaving readers no vantage point, no moral pivot, nothing but an eavesdropping on an analysand and an analyst, both of whom seemed verging on parody. This is the book's virtuoso achievement. We don't have here just any stream of consciousness. This is stream of consciousness that costs you a couple of $100 an hour, 4 days a week, and you inevitably become pretty practiced at it. In his infamous chapter that Roth calls Whacking Off, for example, Portnoy's memory of the butcher shop leads to a discovery of a little dot on his penis, which is certainly cancer. The only fit punishment for a crime of violating his family's dinner. But now a mature, ironic erudition intrudes. I am the Raskolnikov of jerking off, he said. My God, Portnoy asks, what is freedom and what is merely shaking the bars, and so on. You start with the grievance, you see, then move to the fantasy of retribution, then to guilt, and then to an original childhood fear. You dwell on the fear, and then, in a tribute to the safety of the couch, move to sadness. As you search for the sources of sadness, you uncover memory, which provokes feelings of poignancy, of loving connection, then hunger, then erotic charges, then loss, then a new, or putatively new, grievance. You start with pain, burrow into dirt, get to memory, and end with motive. There is nothing really free about the associations here. One thing leads to another because, at least in psychoanalytic terms, each thought follows from the other. Roth presumed an audience familiar with the rhythms of the psychoanalytic project, so he let things rip. He also presumed you knew psychoanalytic theory, and therefore how Portnoy's Jewish family made things all topsy-turvy. Oedipus complex? My God, the knife is in mommy's hand. The superego comes as a low-voltage father who cannot stop struggling with his bowels. The angst persists well beyond infancy because the son is preferred over the father. The only thing worse than Oedipal tension is Oedipal victory. And community only colludes in this inversion. In a Jewish home, the superego had a 5,000-year head start. Some readers concluded that, therefore, the forbearing Dr. Spielvogel must be the only vindicated character in the novel, that Roth was valorizing an old secular Jewish type, skeptical, like Freud, of the culture of Judaism. Alas, the enigma of Portnoy's complaining is bigger yet, for the novel leaves us with the lingering suspicion that Spielvogel, too, represents an orthodoxy. Leaves us wondering if Spielvogel thinks he has an explanation for everything, from pleasure to process, that there is hubris in Spielvogel's authority, too. Remember Spielvogel's definition of Portnoy's complaint on the front piece of the book. Quote, a disorder in which strongly felt and altruistic impulses are perpetually warring with extreme sexual longing, often of a perverse nature. In this context, with Portnoy squirming so truthfully, could anything be more condescending than the word perverse? Now we may perhaps to begin, yes? Poor Portnoy, now trying to please his doctor the way he had tried to please his mother and father. Portnoy keeps wanting to be healthy in the classical way a well-analyzed man is expected to be. That he wishes he had a strong preempting father, a guilt-free memory of mother's love, so that he could, according to the theory, stop lusting for a wilderness of monkeys. You see, I just can't stop or tie myself to anyone, Portnoy shouts. He's relentlessly hoping for the very cure that Spielvogel seems poised to supply. But the rhetoric of Portnoy's monologue and the construction he puts on his family both seem to be supplied by Spielvogel too. Not coincidentally, Roth told me he had just finished an analysis with a psychoanalyst quite like Spielvogel, whom Adam knows rather well, who tried to persuade Roth that narcissism was the source of his art and his domineering mother and weak father were the source of his narcissism. Philip told me, it frustrated me terribly because his characterization of my mother and father was so false. But he gave me a good idea. This was a better family to use than my family. And that's around the time, he says, I went to Iowa to teach writing, where I had a disproportionately high number of Jewish students. And again, they'd write about this folkloric Jewish family, tough mother, weak father. Their stories may have been true in their detail, but never mind. The stories were organized around this folklore. I said, fine, you want this Jewish family? I'll give it to you. Portnoy's complaint at its deepest is thus meant to explode the idea of the psychiatric perverse, the psychiatric normal. Roth told me, once you take the categories of illness and health seriously, then you are leaving the atmosphere of this book. Then you are beginning to impose another vocabulary and a foreign, alien vocabulary on this book. Of all the orthodoxies undermined in Portnoy's complaint, psychoanalytic orthodoxy may be the most insidious because it's the most hidden. Spielvogel is also a weaver of fictions, but to write fiction well, Roth implies, you first have to acknowledge that you're doing it at all. Portnoy's complaint left us laughing and queasy and talking. Can you really say this? Is this also me? Was the doctor really right? The joke was on everybody, parents, lovers, Jews, patients, analysts, which is another way of saying it was on the act of reading itself. We get things wrong, he says. Somewhere else, he writes, we get things wrong, and then after careful consideration, get things wrong again. Der Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. Men strive, God laughs. And so, though I know I should be pitied for saying this, although Adam kind of opened the door to it, I consider Portnoy's complaint something like the culmination of the 60s in America, a decade of advancing civil rights, a decade of awakening to liberalism's full implications. Why? Because we were supposed to be judged, said Dr. King, not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. And the trailing insight of Portnoy's complaint was that judging character was not going to be as easy as it sounded. Character is made of enmeshment, like the Jewish family, and is described by fictions like psychoanalysis. Portnoy's complaint aimed to prove liberalism's largest, most precious moral claim, that all orthodoxy is suspect. That precisely because language and experience are relative, the principle of tolerance must be absolute. No text is sacred. Only the right to interpret texts is sacred. At the end of his life, Roth insisted that he himself could not reread Portnoy's complaint. But he was being too hard on his younger self. The book was a milestone in a life's work. That work would show us, ironically, how little a work our lives are. Thank you.
We're waiting for a clip, a film clip. Is that coming up? We're waiting for the orchestra. Okay, I think we should go on with the program then.
Yes, okay, so the orchestra will wait. We'll have to let the orchestra know that they will come after your discussion.
Okay.
Okay, so now we go with the clip then, Ricki.
Excuse me?
So now if you go with Daniel, we go with the clip first.
Okay, you go with the clip first?
And then you and Daniel,
Yes,
then the orchestra.
okay.
Just somebody has to tell the orchestra.
Okay, so let's play the clip.
Widely fated for a career spanning 6 decades, after a shocking debut, the scope and achievement of Roth's work only grew. Over 31 books, he charted the American century, detailing both the political and the personal. His 1960s novel, Portnoy's Complaint, about a teenage boy's efforts to keep his obsessive masturbation a secret from his overbearing Jewish family, was a sensation and marked him out as a provocateur. He then turned this same fearless vision to the American dream, never afraid to look hard at the extremes of human experience as his characters become impaled on history. He explores the heights of love and the depths of depravity and loss. But the intensity of his childhood growing up in Newark, New Jersey, never left him. This vibrant immigrant city became central to his work.
So, a publisher friend of mine recently said that Isaac Bashevis Singer was Jewish in the right way for a Swedish audience. And therefore, he sold more per capita in Sweden than in any other country. Actually, more than 2 million copies. The Swedes loved him. Philip Roth, on the other hand, is Jewish in the wrong way, said my publisher friend. Maybe it's all the play with identities. Maybe he's too nervous. So he does not really appeal to the Swedish reader. And he does not really appeal to the Swedish Academy. Daniel Sandström is a Swedish journalist and critic, nowadays in charge of fiction at the publishing house Bonniers here in Stockholm. We first met when he was the cultural editor at the newspaper Svenska Dagbladet. And there we had 2 heated conversations about Philip Roth. And I do remember that I was somewhat puzzled afterwards. And I asked myself, how come this guy from the little city of Lund in Skåne is so intensely engaged in Philip Roth and his books, even more than I am? Now is the time to get an answer to that, and to some of the questions concerning our academy. Please give Daniel a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Ricki.
So
it's going to be tricky doing this in English, but
so I think we should start with, how did the 2 of you hit it off?
well, the long story is that I read him when I was 30 years old, and I was still a PhD student, and I was drowning in theory, basically. This was in the 90s, and literature studies was not really about literature. So on a vacation, I bought American Pastoral, which was just out, and it blew me away totally. And for me, it gave me renewed hope about what a novel could do, and what the novel should be about, the sense of both structure and also the sense of history, and the way that history beats down on an individual in that tragedy that it is, made me rethink what I should do with my life. So later on, when I became a journalist, I had the opportunity, through luck and thanks to good publicists, to do one of the last interviews with Philip Roth for Svenska Dagbladet. And that was a treat in a lot of ways.
Okay. So that was how you received American Pastoral. But maybe you could say a few words about the reception in Sweden when it comes to Philip Roth.
Well, it's interesting. The reception, I think, has been different, varying over time. But I do think that there was a time where he's, after Portnoy, later in the 70s and the 80s, where his stocks weren't that high. And I think that American Pastoral reignited, there were quite a few books that hadn't been published in Sweden over the years because he'd not been deemed as important. With that trilogy, he came back into the public eye, and I don't think it's really correct to say that he was not loved in Sweden. I think this evening here tonight shows quite the contrary. But I do think that he came back as a serious contender for the prize, for instance. But also, if you look at the way that he's been received, and also the way the obituaries when he died, it was obvious that there was kind of a few things that you wanted to put emphasis on. So when he died, he was very much, his big theme was America. It was not Jewishness, it was not sexuality, it was not sense of humor, it was America. And I think that way tells something about how Sweden perceived him. There were things that they liked to talk about regarding Roth and things you didn't want to talk about regarding Roth.
So, let's move into the different explanations why he didn't get the prize.
I have to make a confession. I'm not a member, thank God, of the Swedish Academy, so I don't really know the bottom line here. But I do think that you could. There's some factual evidence and some conjecture you could make a case. And firstly, I think that the fact that he was American, and not only American in general, but he said so himself. If I'm something, I am an American writer. America made me. And that's the theme of the post-war author, choosing his freedom as in line of what the idea of America should be. So, and the Academy, the last time an American novelist got the Nobel Prize was Toni Morrison, and that's over 20 years ago. So it was kind of obvious that, and also some of the Horace Engdahl, the previous permanent secretary, has also said that American literature is insular. It's not part of the great discussion about literature. And that kind of arrogant words about American literature that he's been kind of open about. So that is one of the reasons, I think. To be American is not a good match if you want to go for the Nobel.
Okay.
And secondly, you have not only that he's an American novelist. And he's not only just any novelist. I think that I interviewed Sadie Smith a couple of years back, and she said, you could say whatever you want about Roth, but if you look what he's been doing to the novel for the last 3 or 4 decades, it's amazing. And she's totally right. I mean, he was a realist, he was a postmodernist, he was a memoirist, he was a satirist. He did everything with that form, and going up late to Plot Against America and Exit Ghost, he really tried to do everything with the novel as form.
So why wasn't that appreciated by the Academy?
The Academy they don't like Americans, and I don't think they like novels as much either. If you look at the evidence, the hard facts, there are, the novelists who have been given the prize in the last decades or so has been Modiano is a great writer, but the novel is not really what he's about. Coetzee has done great novels, but he's kind of in the Beckett tradition of novels, totally different from especially with the major trilogy, which is kind of a renewal of the traditional historical novel, in a sense that I think was not really something that the Academy would applaud. So that's the second. Okay. And third, I think that if you look at the Academy, and this is now we come into the more, I'm a guessing game on my part, but I think that with that kind of gender bias that you've been having on the Academy for so long, which is basically in their DNA, with 14 female prize winners and 100 male award winners, I think that they would not be kind of credible coming to defend a controversial decision like Roth. They're more attuned to discuss something like Dylan, which is controversial, but on a different scale. They had not a lot of credibility when it comes to gender bias, and I think that could make them afraid actually to go that way.
So what about the Joyce Carol Oates syndrome that I've heard about? That means you write too many books, and you write too many books that are not so good.
I think that's something that you always say when it's practical. I don't think if you look back at the history of the Nobel, there's so many great authors who have made bad books. And then you have standout books. And I think that, of course, there are later books by Roth, like The Dying Animal and The Humbling, who aren't that great at all, actually. But I think if you look at especially the comeback, as I mentioned, with Sabbath, but then with the American Pastoral and After Human Stain, I think it was obvious to the whole world that he was playing on a different level, that he did something to the novel that really was amazing. And I think so. I don't think that question really holds up.
Okay. So maybe, Daniel, you could say something about this, I think, exceptional second wind.
Yeah.
He's a person who is in the middle of his 60s and he's producing 4 major novels.
I think we've spoke about this earlier tonight. The actual hours that he put into his work, that's one. If you do that for so many years, eventually you come into, you learn the trade and you get to be the master. And so I think that's one of the cases. But I think also the fact that he returned to the U.S. after a period in the UK, and also felt the way that history, which became a big theme for him in those novels, how that could crush an individual in a way that I think that we could, as very much modern, but also attuned to classic tragedy. I think that's hard work, and the fact that he got his themes right. I mean, if you look back and read Goodbye Columbus, his breakthrough, his first book, it's some of the themes there. Yeah. They come back in the trilogy, especially the idea of you try to escape your origins, your culture, your family, and eventually something will crush you for that. And the idea of passing, that you have in The Human Stain, is extremely timely. But he's been writing about that all the time, and suddenly he found the right form for it, and it just exploded.
Mm-hmm. Do I hear you saying we need a new academy?
I think it's I don't need to say that. I think I think in the long run, actually, this one will be the Academy's loss. Philip Roth will be loved for a long time, and he will be discussed for a long time. And I think that the heritage will be. There's no doubt in my mind that he was one of the major novelists of the last century. So if you miss out on that one, you're the one with the problem.
Okay. But still, I think it's interesting to look at the fact that there are no real Rothian followers. There is no real Rothian school of writing. Or is that an exaggeration?
We have a wonderful audience here tonight that really, some kind of following, I think there is. And I think if he had gotten the prize, I think it would be both controversial but also extremely popular. Because I think a lot of people, we've sold quite a few books, to be honest. So I think also sometimes, Lisa mentioned this earlier, that I've met younger female novelists saying that American Pastoral is their favorite novel. I don't think that this general idea that he's a male writer for male readers is true. I think he's a writer who wrote for readers, people who really, really loved books, sentences, the voice, the novel. He was, I think, we mentioned things that the Academy didn't like, him being American, a novelist, but I think also in Sweden we are kind of puritanical. So Puritans, they have a hard time accepting some of the things that he's writing about, and that's not really something that we do so well in Sweden. So maybe that and the sense of humor. We're not really always the funniest country in the world.
Ooh. Okay. So Daniel, I'm sure there are very, very, very few people in the audience who haven't read Philip Roth. But if there is, where would you recommend them to start?
I think it's, you could go, I mentioned the trilogy, of course, but everybody knows that. And I think that you could actually go back to, I know that when I met him and interviewed him, he didn't really like the idea of talking about his first book. But I think everything is there in Goodbye Columbus. I think the short stories about identity and how to escape that, and the humor, the anger, the voice, I think it's there. And from there on you could go, and then I would especially want to mention the Zuckerman novels, because I think Zuckerman is a fantastic invention from any author. To find a voice, a creation, a vehicle that could do so many things for you, and to study that throughout the books, that's a feast.
So when you interviewed him, and you were one of the last people interviewing him, right?
There were quite a few last interviews, to be honest.
Quite a few last interviews. But anyway, I'm curious, do you think that you got the possibility to do that because you worked for Svenska Dagbladet, and this is where the Nobel Prize happens?
Let's put it like this. I think that this was in 2013, and so he'd stopped writing novels, and I think he was slightly bored, actually. So the interview, we spoke on the phone, where he basically, made sure that I knew some of my stuff. And then the interview was conducted on email. And it was obvious to me that he wanted that interview to be about certain things. And there was one question about misogyny, there was one question about the academy, and he said, I would love to talk about this. So he was not shying away from that, which was interesting because normally you'd expect them to go the other way. But so when the answers came on email, it was like small essays. It was obvious to me that he had been enjoying himself. And that he loved to write, but he couldn't write anymore for different reasons. So this was a way for him to do that. And eventually that interview ended up in the last volume of the Library of America, Why Write? And it was published in the New York Times. So he took the opportunity to say what he wanted to say, and I was just a good vehicle for that. And thank you anyway,
Great.
That was great.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you.
Okay. And now we will listen to Franz Schubert, Symphony number 5, B-flat, second movement. Welcome to the orchestra. There is something wrong with all his female characters. A woman writer and friend of mine once said in New York, I cannot identify with them. Mostly I don't like them. And behind it all, I feel as if he doesn't like women. Not really. This has been an issue all along, and we've touched upon it several times this evening. Claudia Roth Pierpont is a writer and journalist. She's been a contributor to The New Yorker since 1990. Wrote a great biography a few years ago called Roth Unbound, and was also a friend of the author. She will now give us her view of his female characters. Please give Claudia a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. A woman named Anna Ziad plays a small role in Roth's tremendous novel about Israel, Operation Shylock, published in 1993. A book filled with Israeli and Palestinian voices shouting furiously at one another, as well as some Israeli voices shouting among themselves, over the abyss of their long-standing hatreds. Anna is a small Palestinian woman with enormous eyes, and she suffers terrible migraine headaches. The time is the mid-1980s, the years leading up to the First Intifada. And Anna's husband, a distinguished Palestinian intellectual, has moved with her and their teenage son from Boston, where he taught literature, to the West Bank, where he is seeking the return of his father's land and where he is losing his mind with anger and despair. Anna cannot bear to see what the move has done to her husband, and most of all, she fears the future there for her son. She provides the book's least political, most practical voice, a protective mother's voice, it may be said, and in that a distinctively womanly voice. When she cries out against what she calls the childish, stupid ethnic mythologies she sees on both sides. Trying to save her family, or at least to have her son sent back to Boston, she confronts her husband about his loyalties. And this is Anna. Why aren't you loyal to your intellect? Why aren't you loyal to literature? Isn't it life any longer when people have a big, bright apartment and quiet, intelligent neighbors and the simple, civilized pleasures of a good job and raising children? Isn't it life when you read books and listen to music and choose your friends because of their qualities and not because they share your roots? Roots, a concept for cavemen to live by. We don't find out if Anna gets her son back to Boston or anything else about her fate. Operation Shylock is a book about an immense historical problem, an immense modern tragedy, and it moves on too swiftly to allow for many resolutions. And Anna is far from a major character, although she is a crucial one. Her voice, so desperately rational, haunts the book. Much the same is true of another extremely rational young female who challenges male hysteria, young Alexander Portnoy's sister, Hannah. How many people have paused for a moment in the uproar of that revolutionary book, as Roth himself paused, to question why the older Portnoys, their parents, the source of Alex's wild rebellion, behave as they do? Roth pauses just when 14-year-old Alex is most angry with his parents for their nearly paralyzing worries and restrictions and fears, all incomprehensible to their fully American, freedom-seeking son growing up in New Jersey in the late 1940s. It's Hannah Portnoy, their equally American daughter, and still a teenager herself, who tries to calm her brother's fury by suggesting that their parents' endless anxieties have something to do with World War II. A suggestion that prompts Alex to say, snidely, "I suppose the Nazis are an excuse for everything that happens around here." The girl's simple reply, "Maybe," she says, "maybe they are," is a glimpse into something much deeper than Roth was able to take on at the time he was writing Portnoy in the late 60s. She goes on to ask, "Do you know where you would be now if you had been born in Europe instead of in America?" And when he doesn't reply, she tells him, "Dead, gassed, or shot, or incinerated, or butchered, or buried alive." The contrast that Hannah makes so bluntly between a Jewish childhood in the death traps of Europe or among the oblivious freedoms of America during the years when Roth was growing up haunts not just the book, but the rest of Roth's writing life. 10 years later, in the novel The Ghostwriter, this life and death contrast was given flesh, so to speak, in the resurrected figure of Anne Frank, who in Roth's painfully convincing fantasy turns out to have survived the camps and ultimately arrives in the green hills of New England. What might it have been like for her to see her old diary discovered, to see herself, presumed dead, made a symbol of the deaths of 6 million human beings? I know now, because Roth told me about it in one of the hundreds of conversations we had for my book. I know that he worked for years on different ways to present the martyred girl, the martyred young writer, who meant so much to him that he was willing to risk even more than the usual condemnation from some Jewish readers by taking on her sacred story in fiction. When I first read The Ghostwriter, though, I could only marvel at how he had come to inhabit his Anne's emotions and to deliver the most chilling judgment, truly as though through her remarkable eyes, on the historic nightmare that had engulfed her family and the meaning she herself has taken on for the world. These female characters, major and minor, have stayed in my mind over the decades since I first read these books. I do not say they are representative women in Roth's work, because I don't think there are representative women in his work. A great novelist deals with particularities, with individuals, with complexities and contradictions. What does Michelle Cowan, a sophisticated wife and mother, and another important character to me from Sabbath's theater, and we'll hear a little bit more about her in a while, what does Michelle, who finds too much security boring, have in common with the frantic Mrs. Portnoy? What does the smart suburban princess Brenda Potemkin of the early novel Goodbye Columbus have in common with the teenaged fury Mary Lvov of the 1990s novel American Pastoral, a bomb maker who wants to blow up America? These women are not only independent personalities, they are embedded in their times. It's worth remembering that Roth's characters, like his books, span a full 50 years. These are women shaped by social limitations and liberations, by wars, Mary Lvov by Vietnam, no less than Anna Ziad by Israel-Palestine, by politics, by economics. There is one generalization to be granted, however, and it is spelled out openly in Roth's early books. And that is that women cannot, must not, should not live through men, or there is hell to pay for both sexes. Philip Roth himself, a skinny boy growing up during World War II, was entranced by the strong American soldiers who took a break from saving the world to shoot dice with him on the sidewalks of New Jersey. That is, he was entranced by ideas of masculinity. What it meant to be a man is a major subject of his work, particularly in the early books. Books either written in or set in the 1950s through the mid-1960s, years when sexual roles were tightly fixed. What it meant ethically to be a man, that is, during the years when a man was defined by his responsibilities to work, to family, and a woman was defined mostly by a man. The heroine of When She Was Good, published in 1967 but set earlier, is driven mad, literally driven mad, by the narrow boundaries of her life. A pregnancy that forces her to leave college, no work of her own, a flood of disappointments in the men she was taught to believe would fulfill all her needs. But Roth states the problem most clearly 7 years later in the novel My Life as a Man, very aptly titled, in which a writer's wife, or better put, a very smart woman who wants to be a writer, but is limited to the role of a writer's wife, becomes so filled with resentment that she becomes her husband's worst enemy. Unlovely as these heroines are, Roth's explanation of their rage is no different from the urgent feminist messages of the era. I quote him now. Vicariousness was her nemesis, he explains of the writer's angry wife. What she got from men was all she got. Writing some 20 years later, in the mid-1990s, in Sabbath's theater, Roth gave us a very different kind of heroine, Drenka Balak, a woman whose pleasures are anything but vicarious. Drenka, a married woman, is as sexually free as any man, and she departs from the tradition of literary adulteresses by suffering not at all for the way she lives. She has work that she does well, a grown son she adores, and her attractiveness does not depend on youth or beauty. She's in her mid-50s, not slender, and the physical signs of her age, Roth refers to the minutely cross-hatched flesh at the base of her neck, arouse tenderness as well as passion in our hero, Mickey Sabbath. Drenka casts her spell through warmth, humor, openness, and vitality. She's an earth mother, a free spirit. She gives as good as she gets, desires as much as she is desired. Sabbath's theater is, among many other things, a serious love story about Mickey and Drenka. But the book also features quite a lot of sex. It's no secret, it's been talked about here often, that Roth has been criticized in recent years for the sexual way that many of his male characters view women. I confess I have always found this simply to reflect the reality of our species. And I've even felt at times that Roth was providing some helpfully honest inside information on his gender. But most important to consider, it isn't Roth's women, but his men, who are relentlessly demeaned, shot down, and made ridiculous by their helpless subjection to the hormone that Mickey Sabbath calls preposterone. Things almost never turn out as they plan. The grown-up Alexander Portnoy's attempt to force himself on a nearly 6-foot red-headed Israeli ex-soldier leads to immediate impotence and a solid kick in the chest. And things get worse as the men get older. Poor Nathan Zuckerman, after prostate cancer, is rendered permanently impotent while continuing to suffer tortures of infatuation. The most sexual of Roth's heroes, David Kepish, is introduced when his entire body in Roth's tribute to Kafka turns into a 5-foot, 11-inch female breast. Once Kepish returns to human form in later books, he decides to flee his marriage and pursue the 1960s sexual revolution to its full logical conclusion. That is, to lead a personal life made up entirely of carefree sex. Alas for him, he ends up agonizingly in love with a younger woman who immediately leaves him. The Dying Animal, the book in which Kepish explains his grand philosophy of sexual freedom, is in fact a monument to that philosophy's failure. Kepish concludes that absolute freedom is no more a way to happiness than the old prison of his marriage. The basic contradictions of the human animal, security versus freedom, cannot be resolved. And after the sexual revolution, with the old model of dutiful manhood destroyed, something terrible has happened to modern men. Kepish's best friends are his former girlfriends, and he is surprised to learn of their terrible difficulty in finding adequate partners, because the men they generally meet are, and this is a quote, narcissistic, humorless, crazy, obsessional, overbearing, crude, or they are great-looking, virile, and ruthlessly unfaithful, or they are emasculated, or they are impotent, or they are just too dumb. Perhaps the greatest mystery about Roth is why more men don't complain about their depiction in his books. Thank you. Maybe it's because, taken one by one as individuals, they are so heartbreakingly human, just like the women. Often absurd, but human. Deeply flawed, but all the more human for it. I have felt very close to any number of Roth's characters since I began reading his novels nearly 40 years ago, riveted all along the way, not by what he has to say about men or about women per se, but about human beings. I've been riveted by Mickey Sabbath's troubles as much as by Dranka's, by Swede Lvov's pain as much as by his daughter Mary's, by Anna Ziad's husband's terrible anguish as much as by Anna's practical wisdom. Riveted, that is, not only by characters who reflect me, but who take me far outside my own limited experience, as the best friends do. When I was writing about Roth's work, I tried to make a general list of subjects he addressed in his books, and I came up with this loosely chronological list. Jews in America, Jews in history, sex and love and sex without love, the need to find meaning in one's life, the need to change one's life, parents and children, the trap of self and the trap of conscience, American ideals, the American betrayal of American ideals, the upheavals of the 60s, the Nixon presidency, the Clinton era, Israel, the mysteries of identity, the human body in its beauty, the human body in its corrupting illness, the ravages of old age, the coming of death, the power and failings of memory. It seems to me that there is more than enough here for everyone, and that in a world increasingly divided into ever-narrowing identities, where people increasingly define themselves through exclusion, one of the most important feats of Roth's astoundingly generous body of work, aside from the pleasure it gives, is the burning light it casts on our mortal selves and all we hold in common. There is going to be a reading now about Michelle Cowan from Sabbath Theater. It shows how Roth can give you a complex woman sympathetically rendered in a single page. All you need to know now is that Michelle is 55 years old, unhappily married, and suffering from hot flashes. All you will hear is what Mickey Sabbath deduces from the wonderfully low-down rumble of her laugh. Thank you.
Skrattet sa att allting hade förändrats hos henne medan hon vände ryggen till. Medan hon tittade åt andra hållet, det rätta hållet, med armarna vidöppna mot den dynamiska tillsatsen av krav och nöjen som hade varit vardagsmat för henne när hon var 30 och 40. Mot all den där oförtrutna aktiviteten. Allt det extravaganta, semesterlika livet som oupphörligt var upptaget. Med resultatet att det inte skulle ta längre tid än det gjorde för Cowens att flyga över Atlanten med Concorden för en lång weekend i Paris, för henne att bli 55 och bräseras av vallningar. Och nu var det hennes dotter som var den kvinnliga figur som utstrålade de magnetiska strömmarna. Skrattet sa att hon var less på att stanna kvar. Less på att planera att ge sig iväg. Less på otillfredsställda drömmar. Less på tillfredsställda drömmar. Less på att anpassa sig. Less på att inte anpassa sig. Less på så gott som allting utom att existera. Att njuta av att existera medan man är less på allting. Det var det som låg i det där skrattet. Ett till hälften besegrat, till hälften roat, till hälften betryckt, till hälften förundrat, till hälften negativt. Ett dråpligt gapskratt. Och han gillade henne. Han gillade henne oerhört mycket. Troligen lika outhärdlig partner som han var. Han kunde varje gång hennes man talade märka en lust att vara en smula grym mot Neuman. Han såg henne hånle åt det som var bäst hos honom, det allra bästa hos honom. Och om man inte blir galen av sin makes olater så blir man det av hans dygder. Han äter Prozac för att han inte kan vinna. Hon håller på att förlora allt utom sin bak som blir bredare för varje ny årstid, vilket hennes garderob berättar för henne. Utom den är prins till man som utmärker sig genom sitt resonabla sätt och etiska ansvar. På samma sätt som andra blivit ärrade av vansinne eller sjukdom. Sabbat förstod hennes sinnestillstånd, hennes livstillstånd, hennes lidande tillstånd. Skymningen sänker sig och sex, vår största lyx, försvinner bort i en förfärande fart. Allting försvinner bort i en förfärande fart. Och man undrar över hur dum man kunde vara som någonsin tackade nej till ett enda eländigt ligg. Man skulle kunna ge sin högra arm för det om man är en sötnos som den är. Det är inte så olikt den stora depressionen. Inte så olikt i att gå i konkurs över en natt efter år av goda inkomster. Ingenting av det oförutsedda som inträffar, berättar vallningarna för henne, är troligtvis någonsin mer av godo. Vallningar som hånfullt härmar de sexuella extaserna. Nedsänkt är hon i den flyende tidens eld.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you, Claudia. And we will end with a video clip. And Lizzie, are you on your way? Okay, so we will come on. Kom, vi reser oss på. Okay. Okay. But we're getting something. Okay.
Just want to say thank you, everyone, for making this wonderful program. Thank you, audience, for joining us. We're going to end up, as Ricki says, with a tiny, tiny clip, and we'll go from there, okay?
Okay.
It's absolutely, well, an absolute last one. Absolutely last appearance on any stage anywhere.